If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this.
For hunters, outdoors enthusiasts, and those who often venture deep into the woods for camping and hiking, what's the creepiest thing or creature you've ever encountered in the middle of nowhere?
I've been practicing witchcraft for about a year. About a month ago, I was visiting the creek to get acquainted with water, establishing connections with the elements. I said a little, "This witch wishes to know you and the dwellers on your banks," etc. I went back later, and there was an orange cat there. I said, "Hey there. Here, kitty." It ran away. Later, I went to my gazebo in the woods, where I meditated and did my witchy things. I was journaling when I heard on the hillside right beside me, "Here, kitty." Now, I must add that we live in a valley, and the acoustics are bizarre. Even my neighbors have mentioned that, strangely, sound carries here. But I was thoroughly freaked out. I left, of course, feeling watched. My witchy friend swore it's a Wendigo and stay out of the woods or you die. Now I'm aware of what a Wendigo is, but I'm also aware that you give power to what you believe in a person. I did every protection spell I knew and stayed out of the woods for 2 weeks. Just to be safe. I visited the woods a couple of times, and everything felt fine. Last night, the same friend and I did a full moon ritual in the gazebo. We were talking, and the candles went low and to the left. No wind. She asked if I felt watched. I said not right now, but by the time we left, it was dark, and it felt like something had followed us out of the woods. What could be going on here? I hate that something is taking my little peaceful, magical slice of paradise and making it something to be scared of. Any recommendations? I appreciate you in advance. I was fortunate enough to grow up on a lovely little, secluded piece of land in Canada. I had a large house that was backed by beautiful forests and woodlands. I never wanted much in the way of entertainment, as myself and my brother Gabriel had plenty of games to play in the dense forest, which kept us busy for most days. I was homeschooled, and as such, I spent a lot of time in and around that forest and grew to love it and know it like the back of my hand. On to the paranormal. My family is not very spiritual. My dad was an atheist, and my mother was a very casual Catholic. I think I might have gone to church maybe twice in my life. Despite this, Dad didn't like going too deep into the forest, and Mom did much the same. They said they got funny vibes from it, some gut instinct, I guess. They didn't have a problem with me and Gabe going in the forest, as long as we were sensible, were together, and didn't go too deep. We had enough of a feel for what was too deep to never cause a problem by venturing too far and getting lost or anything, but we would often still push into the woods a bit to explore new areas. There were some nights where I would be woken up by blue flashes coming through my window, as if someone taped cellophane over a flashlight and was sporadically turning it off and on from above the canopy deep in the woods. Other nights, if the wind carried just right, you could hear voices in the dead of night, sometimes conversation, sometimes wailing or shouting, and other times whispers. Sometimes all three. I couldn't ever really hear what was being said. The woods stretched out for kilometers and, to my knowledge, were uninhabited where the lights and noises came from. On one particular occasion, I guess this activity climaxed. I was about 14. Me and Gabe wandered further than we ever had. We reached a point, and it was like something snapped, I guess. Hard to describe. It was like the feeling you get when you break something and know you're about to be caught. We turned back pretty quickly. I think something led us out of those woods. This happened a year and a half ago, and I am still constantly thinking about it. I was driving to the woods with 2 friends. It wasn't a remote area, it was right off the side of the road next to a one-way tunnel. A train drove above the tunnel, and it was one of the small ones that you needed to honk before you drove through. It was a wooded area with farmland around it. We were chatting, and my friend, I'll call her S, said, "There's something moving over there," and she pointed to the trees. I heard movement as well, and when I glanced over, I expected to see a squirrel or something like that. Instead, all 3 of us saw a human-like figure heading towards us, but he was still in the trees. Our windows were rolled down, and as soon as we acknowledged it, "What the duck is that?" It stopped. I would have assumed it may have been someone walking around, maybe someone homeless, but this wasn't an area where people just walked around, and this is near a fairly small town with a total of 2 homeless people that everyone knew. It definitely was not that. I still would have assumed it was a person, except for the fact that there was no mouth. All 3 of us saw this, and we still talk about it, and we are not paranormal people. It was human-shaped, but it was quite literally shrouded in darkness, which sounds so stupid when I type it, but it was. It didn't have a clear area from where it started and began, but it was human-shaped. I don't want to say transparent or translucent, because that sounds crazy. It had no mouth, but we all saw its eyes. As soon as it stopped and stood there, it literally turned around, walked into the woods, and disappeared. It vanished, and I know that sounds ridiculous, and I'm personally very skeptical, but we all saw it just fade away. We got the hell out of there, and we all talk about it to this day. I'll add that we had this strange feeling before we saw it, just this deep onset paranoia and anxiety that we acknowledged about 30 minutes beforehand. I won't lie, we were smoking a joint, but I truly don't think there was any way a joint could have made us see that. I think maybe it made us more anxious. However, it didn't increase our anxiety to the point of witnessing that event. This happened a while back, but I rarely tell this story simply because everyone I tell it to thinks I'm crazy. In 2018, I, my wife, and my son went camping in South Louisiana. I've always been an avid outdoorsman, and I was trying to get my son to spend time outside, as he is usually a very indoor, video game kind of kid. We get to the campground, and we take a campsite that's secluded towards the rear of the campground and requires a canoe to reach. I love this campsite because you can see tons of alligators on the way, as well as bald eagles and other really cool animals. We get to the campsite through a little creek-like area, the other sides are surrounded by a lake. Our own personal island. All day we fish and canoe, and me and my son play in the creek. Later in the evening, we cook on the campfire, tell stories, and just talk about life. Around 1:45-2-ish, my wife gets worn out and says they will go behind a tree to use the restroom, and then they are going to head to sleep. I said it sounded good, and as they walked off, I climbed into the tent to take some stuff out to make room. As I'm coming out, I see a flashlight by the creek, and my wife's voice rings out, "Hey," my name, followed by his voice, "Yeah, Dad, you've got to come see this." I start heading that way, and then I hear someone moving behind me. I turn to look, and my wife and son walk up and ask me where I was heading. I told them that I heard them calling me from the opposite direction. My wife scolds me and tells me that I know my son is already sort of scared of the woods and that scary stories shouldn't be told to him right before he sleeps. I turn around, and that light from the flashlight is gone. As we lay down, my son finally dozes off. I tell my wife that I was serious about what I heard, clear as day, and she tells me to just give it a rest. To this day, I have no clue how to explain this. I've been to this campsite several times before and after and never experienced it again. It sent chills down my spine to think about it and to think about what I would have found had I gone down to the creek. Thankfully, I found this, where I feel less afraid to share my experience for fear of ridicule. Let me know what you guys think. Back in college, a couple frat buddies and I went summer camping. We decided to hike in the nearby forest and go off the trail. Looking back, this is extremely reckless. We didn't even have any proper navigation tools or gear. Just shirts and shorts. We stumbled upon an abandoned house in the middle of nowhere. And I mean absolutely nowhere. There were no nearby roads, just vague dirt paths that had been overtaken by nature. From the architecture, I would have guessed this house was built in the late 1800s or early 1900s. There was also a parked crane nearby, most likely for destruction. But what was even more strange was that the keys were left in the ignition. That's it. We didn't see anything odd in the paranormal sense. It's just strange. Luckily, we made it back to our campsite. It was a nice autumn night, and my family and I decided to have a campfire. We went outside after it was dark, and we were roasting marshmallows and making s'mores while we sat around the campfire talking. The campfire was at the very edge of the woods by our playground, which was quite far from our house since we had a lot of acres. We had spent time outside at night before, and everything was okay. However, this night we spent a few hours outside, and then suddenly we heard something in the woods. We heard leaves crunching and a stick breaking. We thought it was an animal, so we ignored it. We got back to talking, and then we heard it again. It sounded like it was getting closer and closer. The footsteps didn't sound like an animal, instead, they sounded like a human. Then we heard someone cough in the woods. My family and I all stood there in silence because we were freaked out. We shined our flashlights into the woods to see who or what was there. We saw a man's dark figure hide behind a tree. They were watching us. We left everything outside and ran as fast as we could back to the house. Once we were inside our house, we locked all the doors and windows. My family and I thought that the person watching us this time was the same person as the one that was following my sister and me while we were hiking. We were all scared, and still to this day, I have no idea who was watching us or what they would have done to us if we hadn't run away. After this, we never had a campfire at night again, but instead, we did it during the daytime. Why do I never answer when someone calls my name while I'm hunting? All these stories about the wilderness made me think of a story my cousin told me. Hunting is a huge part of the culture in Hawaii, and kids often learn from a very young age how to hunt. My cousin, who is in his late 20s now and has been hunting for a good 20 years of his life, has had some strange experiences in the wilderness, but this one always stuck with me as the weirdest one. Have you ever heard of a calling spirit? I'm sure they exist outside of Hawaii, but the gist is, if you're somewhere like the woods or you're alone somewhere, if you hear someone call your name, you do not answer. Bad things happen when you answer. I'm going to write the story like he told it to me. I was around 8 years old when this happened, when I had just started going hunting. Me, my cousins, and my uncle went hunting one evening in Wailua. By the time we were done, we were about a mile away from our truck. It was about 9 p.m., and it was dark. My uncle said, "I'm going to go get the truck, you kids wait here." But my cousins wanted to go with my uncle. I said, "I'll wait right here. You come get me, I'm not walking." I was overstepping. My uncle was like, "You sure you want to wait alone?" I said, "Hell no. I'm not walking, I'll wait." So he said he would be back in half an hour with the truck. Not too long after they left, I heard something moving in the bushes. Then I heard my uncle's voice. "Hey, Kai. Come on, let's go." I said, "Hell no, I'm not walking back." And then my uncle whistled. You know when you're out playing with the other kids in the neighborhood and your dad whistles for you to come inside, and you know when you hear that whistle, you better go fast? That's the kind of whistle it was. So I jumped up and started walking. My uncle was walking ahead of me. I couldn't see him in the bushes, but I could hear him because he's saying things like, "You don't want to listen, you're going to get in trouble." Then he said, "Come on, let's go down here." He wanted to go into the bushes, off the path. I knew something was wrong. I said, "But I thought we were going back to the truck?" Just then, I saw headlights, back in the direction we started. And then I heard my uncle's stereo blasting, the only song he ever plays when he goes hunting. I start running. I take off, and something grabs my backpack. I fly my arms back, and I let whatever it was take my bag. I get to the truck, and my uncle asks, "Where's your stuff?" I point back to where I was and say, "I was following you." My uncle turns pale and yells, "Get in the car now." I'm bawling, I'm scared. I know I messed up. I know you never answer when someone calls, but it sounded just like my uncle. He immediately took me to my other uncle, who blessed me. To this day, when I go hunting, I never answer when anyone calls my name. When I was about 11, maybe 12, my family and I moved out to the middle of some abandoned strip mines in rural Alabama. It was awesome. Going swimming in quarries, lots of abandoned equipment and cliff faces to climb, caves, and miles of trails, abandoned dirt roads used by the mines, to explore. The trade-off was that there were a lot of venomous snakes, and at night, it was dark. No streetlights, just the occasional porch light, maybe every mile or so on the main road. One day in particular, my friend P and I were out on one of the dirt roads that went off to the side of the main mine road. We hadn't been down that road before, but it was like 10 a.m. on a bright summer day, and we figured, why not? We had gone maybe a mile down that road and came to a left-hand turn. Beside that left turn, and alongside the road we were walking on, was a small lake. We walked up to the lake and were watching small frogs and a turtle swimming around when I caught movement across the lake. I saw a man walking away from us, heading up the hill. I poked P and pointed. "Who is that? Why is he out here?" We were miles into the mines. No people, anywhere. No houses are nearby. We both stood up, and as soon as we got right on our feet, he stopped walking. In a split second, he spun around and came running in our direction. We bolted. I mean, ran. Like Gump. I looked back, and he was running faster than any human I'd ever seen. He covered the distance. He had to run down the hill and around the lake to get close to us. That route was easily 300 yards, in seconds. He grabbed me, and we jumped off the road and into a ditch, behind some bushes. I peeked out, and he was maybe 30 to 40 from us, spinning around in the road, making this god-awful grunting sound. And weirdly enough, I swear he had an entire cooked chicken in his hand. He was wearing destroyed overalls and dirty boots, and he had what I can only describe as a Cro-Magnon brow. Huge. My memory might not be super accurate given how long it's been, but it seemed like his forehead stuck out a little over his eyes. He was the scariest thing I'd ever seen. He spun around on the road and started running back the way he came. We stayed there, in that ditch, for almost an hour, afraid to move. Listening and watching in case he was hiding and waiting. We crawled along the roadside, all the way back to the main road. From there, we walked but stayed in the tree line until we saw the main paved road, and then we ran. Ran all the way back home. I got home, told our fathers, and both of our fathers and P's older brothers loaded up and went looking for him, but never found a thing. All these years later, it still haunts me. And, oh yeah, my girlfriend recently took me out to her grandmother's house to meet and spend time with her family. And where does dear old Granny live? Right on the edge of those same strip mines. I told her the story, and she looked really serious and said, "Y'all are lucky, there's all kinds of bad things that happen in those mines." So yeah, every visit to Grandma means the Glock and the 12-gauge ride with us. Anyway, that's my creepy encounter story. When I was camping one time, we stopped at a small campground for one night before heading to our actual destination the next day. The first weird thing was that we'd never been to that camp before and haven't been back since, but looking out at the river, it just seemed so familiar, like an insane level of déjà vu. I kept walking back to the same spot on the river, like I was drawn to it. Weird, but not too crazy. While we were there, I went on a bike ride by myself into the woods and ended up finding an abandoned cabin. Part of the roof was caved in, there was an old iron stove in a corner, even a bed frame, and a big hole in the center of the floor. I remember the whole thing so vividly that I could draw a map. I thought it was really exciting, so I went back to camp and told my family. They wanted to see it too, so I showed them the way. I'm 100% certain I followed the exact same path. It was less than 2 miles away, and you could still see my bike tire tracks in the dirt. We got there, and there was a big clearing and absolutely no cabin. All I could find were a few random, rusted old gears and tools embedded in the earth. It was like the whole cabin grew legs like Baba Yaga's house and walked away, except even then there might have been footprints. We searched the whole area within a 2-mile radius of our camp as thoroughly as we could but found nothing. We even asked the campground host if there was anything like that around. She said, not anymore. Unless they cleared a whole cabin in less than an hour, there definitely was one that day. The one night we spent there, I had a horrible nightmare about someone being shot and dying in the river next to our campsite. I can still see their blood in the water and the feeling of a body going cold. But I frequently have nightmares and have since I was a kid, so that's possibly coincidental. It was really smoky at the time since there had been a forest fire recently several miles away. As best we can figure out, the smoke made me confused. But I saw the cabin so clearly and even touched things inside, I knew something existed. Maybe I just wasn't sure where. As far as paranormal stuff goes, I've always loved a good ghost story, but I like to keep an open mind. I think there is a paranormal and a rational explanation to everything, and I'm open to either being the truth. I've always seen tons of abandoned stuff in the woods, before and since. A ranger station, a mining camp, old buildings, just some random stairs, even a cellar. Still, that experience always bothered me. I left a letter for the ghost and a bracelet. I wove under a rock by the river at the place I saw in my dream. I'd cry. Just as a nice gesture, I guess, to acknowledge that I saw them. So I'm about 13 to 14 years old, and the one thing me and my father enjoy doing together is fishing and coon hunting. He coon hunted as a kid and sold the pelts for cash. It was kind of something I did just to spend time with my old man. We hunt a handful of spots every fall and winter, so we're pretty accustomed to all the areas and the trails and roads we take. My dad is a bit of a storyteller, one of those who tells the same stories every time we go to a place or remind him of an event. So he has told me 100 times or so about losing his best coon dog, Hank, in the area he claims the locals call the Devil's Backbone. Let's call it TDB for short. TDB is a weird place. Out on a never-ending gravel road, you pass an abandoned schoolhouse, and there is this god-awful grinding of an old oil pump from about a mile away. At the end of the dirt road, there is a T-intersection with a field in front of you that's maybe 5 or so football fields wide. To the right and left of us are woods and brushes. It's a little before midnight when we park the truck, about 200 yards away, and let the dog out the back. Hutch, our dog, has always been a good hunter, so we cheat a bit and let him run. Then, when we hear him bay, drive up the T and turn right or left based on where Hess at. Hutch plops down from the tailgate and shoots into the wood, and me and Dad hop back in the truck, waiting for the call. We crack open the mason jars of chili we bring on every trip, and nothing but our parking lights are on. After about 10 minutes, I hear Hutch howling and going apeshit. I open the door and stand up out of the truck, trying to hear where he is. Dad fires the truck up and plops the lights on. Now, not a minute later, I hear my dog growling, and the sounds of what I know are him fighting with something. Right after that, I'm not sure how to explain this, an upright, let's say man-like figure about 6 walks across the headlights in front of us about 50 years up. His eyes are glowing yellow from what I assume is the tapetum lucidum in his eye. Then silence. No dog, no woods moving, no wind, just the sound of that old oil pump grinding away. I hop back in the truck and look at my dad. "Did you see that?" He shakes his head and says, "He looked like a man with fur, but I couldn't tell, I only saw him a second." We discuss it for a little longer and decide it was probably just another hunter out here who didn't have permission. We were freaked out a little and decided to get hutch and call it a night. I hop back out of the truck and yell for the dog, and Dad turns off the lights on the truck. Now I'm not sure if the lights we saw were always there or if we just didn't notice them till the truck lights flipped off. Above the tree line of the field in front of us were glowing orbs of light of different colors. Orange, light blue, green, and light red, about 25 in total. I sit back down, and we just sit and stare at the lights for what seems like an eternity. We drive closer to the T before a single word is said. The sky glows like you would see a city or large business in the distance. The orbs are just there fixed. They don't move or change color. It reminds me of stadium lights in the middle of a forest. So we sit there and watch, asking ourselves the usual questions. What's back there? Nothing, it's all woods. Combines maybe doing a night harvest? Nope, woods and the river. You sure there are no farms right there? I'm sure. We finally get Hutch back to the truck and get him squared away. We watch the lights for another 15 or so minutes and head home. Watching them in our rear view mirrors as we turn around and drive out. We went back to the spot the next night without the dog and no lights. I hunted that spot 20 times before and many times since, and I have never seen the lights before or after. To this day, I have no real explanation for the lights. It was late August 2011, I was 11 at the time, and I was staying at my dad's house for the weekend. My dad is a very outdoorsy man, he likes nature and makes us go on long hikes. We live directly opposite a wood, so every now and again, my brother and my dad would take our 3 dogs there, Reddington, F.A., and Rip. This was summer holiday time, so I could stay up to whatever time I wanted. My dad took advantage of that. He liked going on late night walks with the dogs, most of the time on his own but sometimes with my brother. I was 11, as I said before, so I still believed hugely in ghosts and the paranormal, so every time he'd ask me to go on these walks, I'd steer away because I was scared of going in the woods late at night. When I finally plucked up the courage to go, my dad was more than happy. We went out the door, and we started talking. We had just entered the woods when we heard a whistle. I said, "Do you come here?" That he said he did. He said not to worry, but his face said otherwise. At that point, I was terrified. I tried to make him go home, but he is a very stubborn man. We were about 30 minutes into the walk when we saw a man sitting on one of the benches near the park. He looked old, late 60s, with white hair, a burgundy suit, a dark wood cane, and a drink of something. When we passed him, we each said our hellos, but he was dead silent, his eyes wide open, and his pale face scared the living hell out of me. We picked up the pace, but then we heard the whistle again. It was louder this time. He moved closer. Sitting on a bench nearer to us, I told my dad, and then we turned around to go back. I don't remember much after that because I pushed away the memories all these years, but as we were walking, we saw a poster on a pole. I was always a curious kid, always nosy, etc., so I read it. Martin Jones, age: 67, height 5,5. I went missing around 10 p.m. on Saturday, July 9th. It was the same man. I beckoned my dad over, but he stopped, eyes wide open, and shouted, "Get away from my son." I turned around, and there he was, just about to grab me, when my dad came over and pushed him away. We ran and called the authorities, but they said they'd never heard of the man, and at that point we never went in those woods again. My grandparents purchased a cabin in western North Carolina in 1991. The property is about 4 acres and backs up to the Nantahala National Forest on 3 sides. The cabin is off a dirt road that has campsites all down it until you reach the main road on the other end. It's a long dirt road, so there are many free camping sites. As my grandparents aged, they quit making the trip there, and taking care of the property was almost impossible for my grandfather alone. No one else in the family wanted the responsibility, so I jumped on the opportunity to own it. I've been going there for weeks on end since I was born to hike, fly fish, learn about the land, and recently care for the home and property. I've spent many nights there totally alone with the dogs, or more recently, with my now 18-month-old tag along. I've never felt afraid, and I've never feared the woods or the critters in them. I have a healthy respect for the wild but never a fear. I took full control about 3 years ago, and it was empty for roughly 5 to 6 years before that. Needless to say, my husband and I had to put in some serious time, money, and labor to get it back to livable conditions. As we'd finally reached that point, we started inviting people to stay with us for weekend trips and vacations. My husband's friend, Benji, came to visit us one weekend while myself, my husband, mom, cousin, and a 2-month-old were staying there. Benji planned on setting up camp down the road, and we convinced him to at least stay and camp in the parking area so he would be close. There's zero cell service at the cabin and surrounding area. I put the baby down to sleep for the night, and we all sat on the porch, totally surrounded by woods. The moon was out, and there was enough cabin light to see all around the home. We were shooting the shit and telling jokes and old stories when, out of nowhere, even with us being loud and goofy, the deepest, angriest yell or growl came from the woods. I can only describe it as an unthinkably large man yelling in pure anger or absolute disgust. It was definitely on the property somewhere, but it wasn't close enough for us to see anything or hear footsteps or other movements. My cousin, a 55-year-old woman who grew up in the backwoods of Alabama, turned white as a sheet and ran inside to sit with the baby without saying a word. My husband quickly grabbed every gun we own, and we stood quietly, without addressing what just happened, totally freaked. I was trembling, the hair on my neck stood straight up, and I was in the cliché mama bear protection mode. Not a minute later, I noticed something even scarier than the noise itself. Now, as a side note, the forest, woods, or whatever you want to call them, is loud during the summer in the southeast United States. Sometimes it's damn near deafening. The bugs are screaming, birds make noises at night sometimes, animals scurry around in leaves, you get the idea. Well, after this thing yowled like I've never heard anything yowl before, the forest went silent. I'm telling you, I could hear my heartbeat in my brain, it was so silent. Not a single peep from a bug, no critters moving, nothing dared make a noise after that thing made its presence known. We decided, after hearing what I can only describe as Lucifer incarnate, that we should move our activities inside for the rest of the night and lock up tight. Even though the cabin is mostly made up of big windows for doors, not the safest thing ever. Benji decided to sleep on the couch, as he was too terrified to go outside for the rest of the night. It was probably a good call and a sentiment shared by us all. We researched the noises of every animal known to that region and even some that weren't native there. Nothing came even remotely close to what this sucker sounded like. We don't go to the cabin without rifles anyway, but we make sure to pack enough ammo to attempt a takedown on a demon now. Nothing has happened to us personally since then, but I finally told my closest neighbor about it. I was afraid they would really think I was insane, but she told me it was Booger from Booger Hollow. She said her dad used to tell her the story while they were out camping, but she couldn't remember it. I guess we'll never know. I'll preface this by saying I have been a skeptic most of my life, but I genuinely don't know what to think anymore. My friends and I have been on a camping trip for my birthday, and on the second day we've had one of the worst experiences of my life. For context, we were at the end of a field that is shaped like a peninsula, with woods on 3 sides. We were cooking on the campfire, blasting Pitbull as there was a concert nearby we couldn't go to, and then we heard what we later found out was a baby coyote crying. We mimicked it because, why not? It started to get closer very fast. We were shining flashlights in an effort to catch eye shine and saw nothing, even as we pointed them directly at the noise. We were shining it in the field area, which was surrounded by woods, in case it crossed. It stopped, so we assumed it was scared, so we turned on Pitbull again. Literally 5 seconds later, it began again, but on the other side of the field and way closer. We, being wimpy people, got in the car and drove to my house, half a mile away, to get a machete and baseball bats, because we assumed it was a raccoon or a lone coyote at the time, and they're not hard to fight. While there, we grabbed a sage stick, a blessed rosary, and a crucifix, as one of my friends is very spiritual and felt something was off. As we got back to the field, my few spiritual friends, and even me, felt very off, and I was extremely nauseous, so as we parked my car, we said to secure food and grab essentials in order to leave. We secured most of the food and stayed in groups in case it was a predatory animal. The noise started circling again, and as we got the last of the essentials from the campsite and began to get back in the car, it started up again directly behind the tent. The last person got in the car, and another friend and I both saw something walking from behind the tent, in a sort of misty form. It was definitely bipedal, and I assumed I was seeing smoke until I got back to my house, and my other friend who had seen it reported seeing the same thing. I regret to say this, but as soon as people got in, I ducking floored it out of the field. As soon as we pulled into my driveway, the noise started up on the opposite side of my house from where the field was, so we all just left half our things in the car. My 3 spiritual friends saged the house and all windows and doors, especially. My cat wouldn't come inside until we saged the house, then stood by the door, staring at it. It's the next day now, and we are all ducking terrified. A deer keeps standing across the road and staring into my windows. We went back in order to take down the campsite, and no food was touched, even an open bag of chips and a cooked potato, so it wasn't a raccoon or coyote. If anyone has a similar experience or advice, please comment. I've never been too spiritual before, and if this is something supernatural or a malicious being, I want to protect myself and my family. 3 friends and I hiked the Heart Lake Trail in Yellowstone 2 summers ago. If you've ever been to Heart Lake, you know it's one of the more remote areas in the lower 48, about 11 miles from the closest road. This wasn't our first foray into grizzly country for multiple overnight trips, but that aspect of backpacking in Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho never truly loses its fear factor. Anyway, what spooked the hell out of us that night had nothing to do with brown bears. While we were chilling by our campfire, I distinctly remember we were talking about our upcoming Teton Crest trail hike later that week. It was around 10:30 p.m. Suddenly, we saw a faint light across the lake. Almost directly across from where we were on the opposite shore. As we pondered whether or not anyone could possibly be night hiking to Heart Lake, it slowly started to get brighter. And brighter. Essentially, no longer at headlamp levels. If you know that lake, it's pretty huge. We passed only 4 people that day, and every one of them was a CDT hiker headed north. The other way. There was essentially no one around but us, and we had that lake to ourselves as far as we knew. One of the more unsettling thoughts going around that campfire was that we knew no one would have been showing up to that shoreline across the lake at that time of night. And if they were insane. That area is very bare, and there's no chance anyone would willingly hike that remote trail in pitch darkness. Even if they got a late start. It's not a trail you could get turned around on or lost on. So the only way you'd ever arrive that late is if you hiked there willingly. As we were nervously clamoring to figure out what the hell it could be, the light began moving towards us, albeit slowly. It was slow enough that it made us question if it was a trick of perception, but fast enough to make that super unlikely. Especially when all 4 of us agreed on that fact. And we knew it was extremely unlikely. We didn't need to even say it. However, we eventually did. But the creepiest part, by far, was when it became clear that it had to be moving towards us. The moment when it was no longer a question. And the reason we knew it was no longer a question is that it was definitely moving over the lake. And, as I said, that lake is big. Now, there is only one explanation for that. It was either a boat of some kind or something that was flying across the lake, extremely low and extremely slow for an aircraft. The problem with that is that the only way to get a boat to that lake would be to chopper one in and drop it. Obviously, that didn't happen. And this light was way too bright and moving way too fast to be some kind of lightweight packraft that was hauled in. Beyond that, no one could have rowed that fast. And we already knew that no one would have arrived at that shoreline at that time. Just when it got to the point where we were certain that what we were seeing was not possible, just about when it seemed that the light had been traveling over that lake's surface for what seemed like a quarter mile, the light winked out. Gone. Never to reappear. I can assure you that during every part of that trip prior, grizzlies were the #1 concern on everyone's mind, being that deep into the backcountry and sleeping overnight at that particular campground, right at the base of Mount Sheridan slopes. And on top of a prime water source. I can promise you this, no one had grizzlies on the brain when they were trying to get to sleep in their tents that night. What made it worse is that when we hiked back out the next morning, the only footprints we saw along the shoreline across the lake, where that light had originated, were the ones we left the day before. Still not nearly creepy enough to keep me out of Yellowstone's backcountry. And it shouldn't be for you either, because the place is absolutely magical. Alien spacecrafts, or not. I am a mage who has been working with magic since a young age. My first Fleshgait encounter is what started my research. Though it only made the problem worse. I took up wildcraft recently, and I make frequent trips into the forest for ingredients. I don't go too far because of them, but they are closing my territory that I use for various purposes. The first encounter in the last 3 months was one of strange standings. It was about 1:30 a.m., and I had begun to hear one of my cats screaming violently, so I went out to check. I looked around my property for a while to no avail. That was until, on my return, I heard the sounds of footsteps on the aluminum roof of our shop. I pointed the flashlight I had with me to where I heard the sounds, and it just about flew off the roof to retreat into the nearby trees. Me, being the idiot I am, followed it into the trees, armed with a knife I use for bears. You don't know fear until you see that there are several of them waiting in the trees. I regained my intelligence at that point and went back to the house. The next experience I had happened on the night of July 4th. There were some people lighting off fireworks in the quarry above my house, so I went to tell them to stop. It was only 10 p.m. when I left, so I only had a flashlight and was on foot. The walk there was fine until I found that the quarry was completely empty and devoid of human life. I started my walk home when I began to get the feeling of being watched. Like a regular person, I tried to put it off and continued on. That worked until I could hear footsteps behind me. Keep in mind that this is in the middle of the Washington wilderness. I took this into account and turned around. I saw something dart off the road as I did. This continued until I reached an actual paved road. The last experience was on Thursday, July 5th. I wanted to check on a stump that I consider sacred. It lays on a line, and it puts out good energy. I was hoping to investigate its surface to see if anything took chunks out of it or if it had more damage than it had previously. The path I took was the one I originally chased a Fleshgait down, but it was clear at the time. Things progressively got worse when I crossed over a creek that I panned for silver in. The correlation is that the creek is a natural barrier against negative energy. A short way past the creek, I began to come upon mutilated corpses of animals, but I continued. I had thought I was on the right path, but I was actually off course. I ended up southwest of where I wanted to go, and things were already south. I thought to myself that it would be a good time to get out of the trees and go home. So I made my way out of the trees onto a logging road and followed it to the paved road. It wasn't more than a 5-minute walk on the logging road. I followed them for a while until I noticed that there was something on this hill above me. When I walked down the road, it followed until I stopped. It continued this until I made my way into the trees along the road so my light wouldn't disturb the neighbors. In my opinion, the forest was quite literally trying to slow my progress. There were tree limbs that were catching on my clothes that were highly bent out of shape and holes just about everywhere I took a step. Then they began to show up. I tried to speed my progress, but the path was treacherous. I somehow made it to our property line before they got too close. Make what you will with this information. I just ask that you don't actively try to troll. Everyone has their own experiences, and trying to dictate what they saw in yours is not okay, but enough negative thoughts. If you have anything you could tell me that might help, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you. There's a place near me that has a nice flat 4-mile walk into a big lake with a couple of lean-tos and a tent site on the shore of the lake. I go there a half-dozen times a year or so. Each lean-to is about 300 yards apart, and the tent site is about 300 yards past the second lean-to. Each lean-to in the tent site has an outhouse, privy, we call them, about 50 yards behind it, further from the lake. This is state land, and it's very remote and all first come, first served. I got to the trailhead about 4:30 last night, and there were no other cars. It was raining buckets. I don't care, I enjoy lying in my hammock in the rain. This was perfect for me, since I knew my tent site would be open. I prefer sleeping in a hammock to the hard floor of a lean-to. I ate dinner, listened to the loons, and had a restful sleep. I woke up once, at 3:30 or so, to pee, then slept for a few more hours. I woke up to the sound of heavy rain again, mixed with loon calls. I ate my breakfast and drank my coffee under my tarp while sitting in my hammock. I started breaking down camp and packing my pack, and as I was taking down my tarp, I got the sudden urge for my morning constitutional. I'm stuffing my tarp into my pack, and I look toward the trail that goes to the privy, and I see a guy, dressed in the same color clothes as me, gray rain pants and olive raincoat, turn off the main trail and start walking away from me toward my privy. Damn it, I need to do that. Why is this guy using my privilege? I really don't want to start hiking back because walking usually loosens things up more, and I don't want to shit my pants. So I'm just standing there in the ducking rain, and I just put my tarp away. All I could think of was that someone came into one of the lean-tos late last night, and maybe his buddy was using that privilege, so he had to use mine. Duck. So I'm standing there for a full 15 minutes just staring at the trail to the privy, waiting for this guy to come out so I can go. Getting dumped on with rain the entire time. Finally, I'm like, duck this, maybe I missed him coming out. I walk through the woods toward the privy and go in. There's no one there. And there is no evidence of any recent use. The pit inside is not very deep, and you can see old deposits but nothing fresh. Well, I had to go, so I made a fresh deposit. It only took me a minute or so. I hiked out past the two lean-tos, and both were completely empty, with nothing to indicate anyone was there. I hiked out in about an hour back to the parking lot, and my car was still the only one there. When I think back on it, I never made out a face on the guy. I thought it was weird that he had the exact same raincoat and rain pants as me. Mine were a mixed set from two different manufacturers, and most people with rain pants have a matching jacket. As I hiked out, I became more and more convinced that I watched myself walk to the privy and then stand there like an idiot for 15 minutes in the rain. I know I didn't just imagine it. I was low-key and kind of mad that this guy was using the privy at my tent site instead of the one at his own lean-to. I'm a practitioner of the craft, so adventures into the mountains, forests, and deserts have always been common for me, and considering I've lived all over the US, I've had plenty of encounters with monsters, fae, and others. This particular story takes place in rural southern Alabama, at a place I'll simply refer to as the Breathing Tree, for spooky purposes. The Breathing Tree was an absolutely massive and cut-up tree on the far end of a roughly square, clearly deep in some forests I found while stepping aside from a creek. I was in the area researching local fae, and it was getting late. I had lost my way and sat down on the side of the river bank and asked for a guide, forgetting for a moment how tricky and unfamiliar fae can be. When I opened my eyes a while later, the sun was getting low, and a butterfly had flapped at the corner of my vision. I interpreted it as a good omen and followed it away from the river. My first mistake. Eventually, I reached the clearing and the Breathing Tree. Frustrated with the dimming light but happy at my regained cell connection, I sent my GPS location to a friend and found I was only a couple hundred feet from a road. I told him to come grab me, and I sat down at the tree to meditate. Within minutes, I heard breathing behind me. A couple years prior, and it would have startled me, but I figured it was some kind of beast, fae or animal, and would soon pass on. Fae hardly like to reveal themselves physically, but auditory hallucinations are simple for the more powerful ones. A few more minutes pass, and I snap to. My mind had wandered to the verge of sleep somehow, and I was wondering why I was suddenly so awake. Then I felt it. Something breathed on my neck. And I stopped moving entirely, my hands felt cold to the touch, and I was sweating despite the cold wind blowing around me. The heavy breathing was rhythmic and ceased when I stopped. Whatever it was large, incredibly so. I could feel its sheer presence behind me, and it shredded any wards I attempted to put up with every breath it took. My mental fortitudes were in rubble, and I was exhausted almost immediately. I gripped the grass and stood with a shaken body. The breathing followed me up, and I knew immediately there was no coincidence. I had ventured too far and trespassed onto something horrible. "What are you?" No response. "I wish to take my leave. I am sorry for my rude behavior." "May I leave?" The breathing hitches, and my neck goes cold as the creature vanishes, and I nearly jump out of my boots at the sudden noise. A dog barks, followed by a flashlight, and my friend. He was at the edge of the clearing. I didn't let him step in, but later on in the drive home, he told me he was waiting for well over 30 minutes for me. He was well over 20 minutes out. This was not my last visit to the Breathing Tree, but definitely the most frightening. I distance hike when I can. Sometimes this means getting up early or staying out late to get as many miles in as possible. Sometimes, walking in the pitch dark with a low light headlamp gets spooky. I grew up in the woods in this area. I've slept under our canopy of stars more nights than I can count. I've trekked thousands of miles of trail, river bank, lake shore, ridge, bottoms, bogs, and creeks. I've hunted the game. I'm establishing this because it's important you understand I've heard, seen, and smelled all this region has to offer in the way of wilderness. My scariest experience, though, happened at about 4:30 a.m. in the morning. It was late spring, so the first morning light wouldn't be visible in the treetops for another 30 to 45 minutes, another hour past that until sunrise. I was on mile 5. I'm on a low bottom that's wedged between two steep ridges. The trail I'm on is narrow, muddy, and completely hemmed in by thick underbrush, young maple, and old oak growth. I'm focused on the small light from my headlamp, just one step after the other, zoned out. Then I heard a loud crack. And I froze solid. This is the part I have trouble describing. 0430 in springtime means I'm the only thing making noise. No birds chirping, nothing. Dead quiet. Mid-step, I froze. When fight or flight kicks in, you have these immediate instinctive thoughts. The thought that instantly flashed in my mind as I stood there balancing myself into silence was, if I hear that again, I'm turning around, and I'm going back the way I came in a hurry. Why? Because that sound was not a branch breaking. It wasn't a deadfall. It wasn't a widowmaker. I was damn sure I had just heard something intentional. Hearing it twice, well, that meant get out of here. To describe it as best I can, it sounded like a decent-sized wooden stick being violently whacked against a smallish tree. More of a fungo bat-sized stick than a baseball bat. The distinction in my head was that this sound was a crack, not a thud or thump. And I have described it as explosive in the past because it was so sudden and so terribly loud. I had the sense that it was about 50 yards directly in front of me, and it was loud and clear. Now, as I stood there, completely spooked, I realized the soon-to-be worst part of my situation. I knew where the sound came from. And I knew where the trail went. In about 30 yards, I was going to come to a 180-degree turn and start up the ridge, going away from the creek. This meant that as soon as I got the courage to move towards this noise, I was going to have to turn my back on it and get up that ridge. This made me very nervous. My head is somewhere between meth fiend murder and Bigfoot bludgeoning. Minutes pass. I just blow my foggy breath into my glasses and listen. Nothing. Dead quiet. I've got about 20 to 30 minutes until first light. I crank up the headlamp and start to slowly creep to the 180-degree turn. When you wear a headlamp in the woods at night, every tree branch in front of you casts a big black moving shadow on the trail. It didn't help. I get to the turn and quickly make the bend. I'm moving pretty fast at this point. Trying to be quiet. Taking tiny, shallow breaths so I can listen while humping it up the trail. And then I smelled it. A stench hits me that I can't describe. I just imagined it wet, rotten, and dead. I've actually worked on scenes where humans have expired in a past life as a firefighter. This was like days-old decomposition, but it just smelled strange. I kept walking fast. By the time I made the top of that ridge, I was huffing, and the first light was showing. I didn't stop moving until full light was out and the birds were chirping. In our woods, I've heard every sound. I've smelled it all. I'm telling you, I don't know what the hell that was. Deadfall, and especially leafed-out branches, make a lot of noise on the way down. I've heard it many times. I don't know. You can take this with a grain of salt, as I was 11, almost 12, at the time. But I was not a kid to make SHT up. I mean, before this, I don't think I've had a paranormal experience, and after it, I've only had a few minor things happen that I'm skeptical over. I've lived in Illinois my whole life. From 0 to 4, I lived in a Chicago suburb. At age 4, we moved to the boonies, a very small rural farm town way closer to Rockford than Chicago. So most of my life, I've really lived near corn and forests. There's a small river near my house. It is big enough to not be a creek, but still pretty small. The area surrounding it is relatively dense forest. Nearby is a small forest preserve, but the area of the forest we had gone to that day was way denser than the forest preserve. I was riding bikes with my best friend at the time, who still remembers this. Basically, we rode to a part of the forest we'd never been to before and started walking in. There were no paths. We didn't even get that deep in the forest until I heard the crack of a thick stick. Now I'm super outdoorsy because of where I live. I used to spend hours during the summer exploring the rural areas with my younger brother, and this was years ago when kids kind of just played outside with no repercussions. My friend, whom I was with, was more of a suburban kid. When the stick cracked, I was the one to start looking around, while my friend heard it but kept looking at her feet. So I looked up for a second and saw something that scared the living shit out of me. A massive black wolf dog thing leapt from behind a tree to another tree. I even remember it was moving west-east in the forest, from my right to my left. It looked like pure shadow. I didn't see hair, eyes, or fur, but it seemed like it was almost blacker than a shadow. Probably couldn't have been more than 20 or 25 feet away. It disappeared when, finally, it was behind the tree to the east. I booked IT. My friend ran after me. Afterwards, we discussed. My friend never saw the actual dog thing, but we talked about the feeling. We both felt as if we were in some sort of dream state. It was a total Oz effect. Things got unnaturally quiet, and I felt I was in a trance, as did my friend. I almost felt my eyes growing heavy during the walk into the forest, and unlike the regular Oz effect, it felt sort of peaceful, but maybe it's because I was a naive kid and didn't recognize danger. We eventually returned home and told my mom, who kind of just brushed us off, of course, but who did comfort me because I was shaking hard. The next day I was on a bike ride with my brother near the woods, and as we were leaving, we heard the most maniacal laugh. It sounded like the devil. I can't even really describe it, except that it was like something out of a horror movie. My brother was in front of me and turned around and gave me an extremely freaked out look, so he heard it too. We ducking pedaled our bikes as hard as possible out and again told my mom, who kind of shrugged. Let me tell you, I slept with the lights on for probably 3 months. During that time, I was constantly on edge and did not sleep well. I just have so many questions. The forest was, a real forest, but it was still close to some houses. Why would a dogman type thing be here? There are also no wolves here whatsoever, and it was far too big to be a coyote, much less a pitch black shadow coyote. How did it disappear as well? And I am not positive the laugh was related. I guess it could have been some older kids that were ducking around with us. It may have been, but it sounded just wrong, and we didn't hear or see anyone else around. After I saw it, I was ducking terrified. I I was 11 and using my dad's dial-up internet to look up things I saw. I was terrified it was an omen of death or something, but thankfully I'm alive 13 years later. Anyway, tell me what you think. My dad and I would occasionally go hunting together when I was a kid. I was 14, and my dad knew a guy who owned what seemed to be half of Georgia. I mean, the amount of property this guy owned was ridiculous. He let people hunt out there, and if he trusted you, he'd let you camp out there for a couple of nights if you wanted. He'd always make sure we had a way to call for help, though, before we did it. I loved camping out there more than I did just going hunting for a few hours and then coming home. I liked the woodsman feel of living out in the woods. We woke up early one morning and hiked into the woods. It was still dark when we got to our stand. We didn't see or hear anything. Not even birds. I remember my dad commenting on it, and looking back, it should have been a sign. Frustrated, we pack up and look for a spot to camp, and we will set up again later that evening. My dad suggested we go deeper in to improve our chances of seeing something, so that's what we did. We hiked for a few hours, found a clearing, set up a small camp, got settled, and passed the time freaking ourselves out by talking about Bigfoot and other woodland creatures. We hiked a ways away from camp, set up our blinds, and waited. Again, nothing. We get back, and our tent has been pulled up and laid flat. Not in a neat way, but it's just kind of laying there. We thought it was just the wind or something, but we didn't put it up right, and it collapsed. We didn't think much of it. Since we didn't see or even hear anything all day, we decided to leave the following day and try again later that week. We settle in for the night, build a really small fire, and just relax. Again, not even birds are making a sound. I remember thinking how odd it was to be this deep into the woods and only hear one or two birds the whole trip. Oh well, maybe we are making too much noise and scaring everything off. We go to sleep soon after settling in. It's pitch black in the middle of the night, and I wake up for some reason just to try to go back to sleep. I'm in that half asleep, half awake phase when I hear laughter. I kind of jolted awake, but I don't hear it anymore, so I figured it was a dream. I lay back down, and a few minutes later I heard it again. It continues and gets pretty loud. I wake up again, but this time my dad is up too. He whispered and asked, "Did you hear that?" And this is when my heart dropped. He heard the laughter too. It wasn't a dream. We heard it again, but it was faint, and now that I'm actually awake, I am paying attention to it. It sounded kind of like several people laughing in unison. It wasn't cackling or hysterical laughter, but just some normal laughter. It didn't last, but for maybe 5 or 6 long mother-ducking seconds. I have never felt that much fear in my entire life. We didn't hear it anymore after that, but needless to say, we didn't get any sleep. As soon as the sun rose, we packed up and left. My dad was convinced someone followed us and was playing a prank. That's why we didn't see anything. He said while we were in the stand and blind, they were scaring all of the wildlife off with their unmasked scent and being on the ground. He says this, but he didn't go back out there for over a month. When he did finally go back, he mentioned it to the guy who owned the property. He wouldn't let my dad hunt there anymore. I didn't say why, either. My dad thinks he made the guy think that my dad was crazy or something. I guess it is possible for someone to have followed us out there. They must be legit ninjas, though, because we went out before daybreak. Nobody but the owner was parked out there that morning. There were dead leaves and sticks everywhere, and when they decided to laugh, it came from different spots. I never heard a footstep. I've got goosebumps. Twin graves. We started the trip later than intended and didn't get to the campsite before the sun went down. There's less than a quarter mile to go, and there's a fork that isn't on our map. I can't quite read the faded sign with our flashlights. Walk a little bit in one direction, past nothing but trees. Walk a little ways down the other side, and it opens up, and we find our campsite. Set up for it turned out to be creepy, night. Next morning, we decide to try and see what's down the other trail. Go right past the sign, around the bend, and there are 2 white crosses in the ground that serve as grave markers. If we'd gone another 15 feet the night before, we would have walked right into them. We looked at the faded sign on the way out. It was labeled Twin Graves. I was really glad we were leaving. I'm a hunter, and I like to hunt wild boar specifically. Though I have been deer hunting and have been known to get a turkey for Thanksgiving, I mostly hunt boar. For those of you who don't know, boars are a big problem in the United States. A sow can have 2 litters a year, and it's not uncommon for a litter to consist of 10 or more pigs. Given that pigs eat anything and everything, it's not hard to see why the Department of Fish and Wildlife makes it legal to hunt them with almost no restrictions. In my state, it's illegal to hunt most large mammals with night or thermal vision scopes, with the exception of boars and coyotes. I'd been saving for a year, mostly for fun money. It's hard to explain to your wife that a scope that costs literally twice as much as the rifle I was mounting it on was worth it. But I did it. I took it to a range and sighted it in. There was an area that was peppered with boar activity that I knew would be perfect for a night hunt. It was easily accessible with my truck, with easy to find spots that I could set up and that overlooked a large, easy to navigate clearing. The night started uneventful, with mostly me tinkering with my new toy and cycling through the settings. I was a little impatient. I'd spotted multiple deer, but they were out of season, and like I mentioned earlier, my current setup wasn't legal for deer. I moved to another spot I'd seen days earlier that probably wasn't much better than my first, but it gave me something to do and a new angle to look around with my new scope. After an hour or so of glassing the area, it dawned on me. This spot doesn't have much animal activity at all, no rabbits or owls. The deer that I'd seen were hundreds of yards from where I was. Why was this pocket of land so dead at night but lively during the day? I'd set up around 10 p.m., and it was about 2 a.m. when I started to think about packing up, maybe setting up a target before I left, and taking some practice shots. I heard a crunch come from the direction I came from before. I panned my scope over and saw the silhouette of a small bear pushing through the bushes. It's important to note that my scope isn't exactly night vision. It's a thermal scope, kind of like a black and white version of what you see in Predator movies. I adjusted my range and zoomed in a little. I remember jolting a little when I saw that it wasn't really a bear, it was a man. Because he was so low and hunched over, I thought I was looking at a young bear. Is that a game, Warden? It couldn't be. I would have seen the headlights coming up the road from where I was perched. And where could he have walked from? I was 30 miles away from anything and on public lands. I was about to call out when I adjusted my sights and noticed he was naked. No shoes, pants, or anything. I remember being disturbed by his movements, like a squirrel or something. Twitchy and grabbing at the foliage, sniffing around and palming the tree. Was that my tree? The one I'd been leaning against earlier? The thought terrified me. Could he smell me? Then he did something I still have nightmares about today. He squatted and placed his hands in the dirt between his feet and stared straight up like a dog mid-howl. And I heard it, a voice coming from that direction, a very compelling female voice. Help! I'm lost. There was a long pause, but neither of us moved a muscle. The center of my sight was trained at the dirt in front of his feet. I couldn't bring myself to aim directly at another person. It went against everything I'd been taught about firearms. Were they lost? Was this some guy that had gone crazy out here? Why was his voice so feminine? Help! Please! I can't walk. The voice called out. That's when I called bullshit. Not only could he walk, but when I first saw him, he was traversing the land with ease for a naked person, so good that I mistook him for a bear. That's a ducking trap. This guy is trying to lure me in with a damsel in his de-stress routine. Luckily, the lack of activity before caused me to pack up most of my gear. I think I may have left behind a hat and a sitting pad, but I didn't give a shit in that moment. I took my eyes off him for a moment to get my pack on. I buckled my chest strap and scrambled for my rifle. To my horror, he was in the same position, but his face was staring in my direction, and I swear I saw a smile. The thermal scope has an effect that makes animals' eyes appear white. How the hell had he heard me get up and put my gear on? He must have easily been 150 yards away. Duck off! I screamed in that direction. He stood upright, and it hit me how tall and skinny he was. Easily 6 feet and very lean. He took a couple of long strides in my direction, and I instinctively sent a round sailing above his head into the tree line. He was freaky as hell, but he hadn't really threatened me. What would I tell the cops? I was unwilling and unready to shoot someone. He stopped dead in his tracks and hunched down on all fours. The next one will duck you up. Go away. He stayed on all fours, and this time I had my sights trained on the center of him. His eyes were just above the grass, like those of a large cat or something. I was trying to stop my trembling, and I knew that my voice had cracked a little on that last warning. I was terrified. That standoff probably only lasted a minute or two, maybe less, but it felt like forever. In an instant, he bolted left toward the tree line opposite the road. So much for not being able to walk. I could barely keep him in my scope because he was moving so fast. He disappeared into the brush, and I sent another bullet sailing high in his direction. I racked another round and tried to pocket that mag and swap for a fresh one, but I dropped it and didn't bother looking for it. I wasn't far from my truck, and I wanted to get out of there. I could hear him in the distance, yelling with this weird sound that could have been a laugh or a cry. I scrambled up the trail and arrived at my truck breathless. I tossed my gear into the cab but kept the rifle in the passenger seat and sped off. For the longest time, I told that story from the perspective of having spotted some deranged crackheads living off the land, like some kind of caveman. I reported it to Fish and Game, but all they did was scold me for hunting at night alone. I never received an update. It wasn't until I told this story on a camping trip that my nephew told me about Wendigos, rakes, and skinwalkers. My story scared the piss out of him because the spot we were camping was technically the same forest where I'd seen the bastard. Just 50 miles east of it. He was so spooked that his mom, my cousin, had to take him home. She was really pissed. I've gone down the rabbit hole with these scary stories. I'm not saying what I saw was definitely a Wendigo or a skinwalker. I'm saying that if such a thing exists, I may have dodged quite the bullet that night. Or maybe it was just a tweaker being Donnie Thornberry in the middle of the night. Either way, I thought I'd share. A few days ago, I decided to spend the night in a forest, sleeping under the stars, for a variety of reasons, escaping the heat and also escaping some difficulties in my relationship, I guess. I've done that in the past, and I'm not scared of big forests at night, mostly because I'm usually the only human around, and we don't have dangerous wild animals. It's relevant to say that I'm not afraid of the dark and not particularly superstitious. I set up camp in a clear area on a hill near an old stone tower. It's an observation tower, it's very small and was never inhabited. I chose this place to avoid waking up covered with bugs, but it also gave me a good view of the forest. About an hour after sundown, I heard strange flute sounds that seemed to come from the forest. It was very short, just a few seconds. I wasn't asleep, I wasn't even falling asleep, so it's not the start of a dream. It also wasn't a bird, it sounded like a melody played on the flute. Also, I don't think birds sing at night. But I'm not sure. As I said, I prefer thinking I'm alone when spending the night in a forest, so I got up the tower and looked around. There were no lights coming from the forest, so there was no campfire or anything. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, so I got back to my camp. I think maybe 15 minutes had passed since the first sound when it played again. Different melody, but similar flute sound. I think it came from somewhere else entirely. At this point, I knew I would have to tell people, so I needed proof. I launched the recorder app on my phone and waited, but nothing. After I didn't know how long, I stopped waiting and went to sleep. I know it's not really an exciting paranormal phenomenon, but when I searched weird flute sounds, it led me here, so I thought, why not tell it and see if people have explanations. Hi everyone. I would love for you to help me with the question that I have had for a long time. What do you think it was? When I was little, around 6 or 7 years old, I used to go with my family to a house in the woods in West Virginia. I loved it, from the view to the atmosphere. Note that the closest house was 20 minutes away. We went there frequently, and I always thought of myself as a Boy Scout. I loved to go in little by little and know small shortcuts and others. I liked to climb trees and see the sunsets and how the sun faded, until one day it was no more than 5 minutes to the house. When I was up in my favorite tree, I heard some branches breaking, but very slowly, not so far away, I heard something big. I heard my mother call me by name, which is quite unusual for her, she usually does this when she's angry. I was excited at first, since I wanted to show him how I climbed trees, which was my favorite. The emotion raced through me until he called me again, but this time in a stronger tone. An instinct took over. It is as if my subconscious says, "Come down and go home." Every time the sound grew louder and closer, it seemed to emanate from all directions. When I lowered my little legs from the tree, I heard the most horrible scream that I will never forget. I heard a twisted scream from something saying my name. There, I ran as much as I could to the house. While I was moving away, many branches were heard breaking as if something was following me, until the sound stopped and followed that or something, letting out a very loud scream like that of a bear combined with a lion. When I got to the house, my mother saw me with a scared face, and she said, "Your pants were pissed," and I said, "Did you call me?" She said no. From there, I told her that at first she did not believe me so much, but when I grew up, she told me that very strange things happened out there. Since that time, I have never climbed a tree or entered a forest alone. Sometimes we talk to my mom about this. Thank you for listening. I believe that this is the most peculiar and unsettling sight I have ever encountered. This happened 6 years ago. My sister and I decided to ride bicycles. We were driving through the forest and were already about to return home. On the left side of us were birches. My sister overtook me and rode in front of me. Next, I saw her almost falling off the bike, swearing, and turning her head towards these birches. I ignored this and continued to drive smoothly. I almost fell and stopped too. The sister was still staring at the trees. I want to say that my sister and I felt the same thing. Do you know the feeling when someone stares at you? This feeling was just tangible. I turned around my head, and for a second my gaze was wandering among the trees, and then I suddenly noticed something strange. This creature was at a height of half a meter. It stood next to the trunk of a birch. It was invisible. At first, it looked like a cube full of dark clots. It wasn't big. It was a small thing. And incredibly strong. His energy struck me with its power and malice. It was tangible and seemed to press on me. I had no fear. When I encountered this creature, I stared at him with hypnotic intensity. I had a feeling that there was only this creature, as if nothing existed. I forgot about everything, about my sister, about myself. I saw only this space where he was. All that I saw with peripheral vision was like a fog. My head was instantly empty, there was not a single thought in it. Nothing at all. Emptiness. I felt that he was looking into my eyes. I don't know how, but I felt it. And this eye contact probably lasted no more than 3 seconds. I kept looking at him. And then something terrible happened. My mouth opened without my knowledge, and I said the following words, "Masha, look, someone is staring at us from the forest." And only after I uttered this phrase did I understand its meaning. Now I'll tell you what my sister saw. When she almost fell and stopped, she also felt someone else's eyes on her. She turned her head to that very place and saw some kind of creature, the same height, exactly the same shape. It was a silhouette, shaped like a cube, something vague. So we really saw the same thing. It was looking at us with a smoldering eye. My sister, too, felt hypnotized, and her head was empty. And the first thought that came into her mind after the numbness was the thought of running away from this place as soon as possible and taking me away. Afterwards, she told me that she wanted to tell me that someone was looking at us from the forest, but she thought that I wouldn't believe her. And then I myself said the same phrase. She became incredibly scared. I felt as if these words that I said were taken from my sister. Her own fears were passed on to me. And this creature made me tell it. When I got out of the stupor, I started to panic. When we left that place, this gaze was pressing on us, as if I had a bag on my shoulders. It was unpleasant and challenging for me. And when we climbed the hillock and drove on, this weight disappeared. It was noticeable. And I understood why. The creature was watching us, looking at our backs as far as possible, as long as we were in his field of vision. I asked on one forum what it could be. Castaneda and my sister told me that it was an inorganic being, and I just got into a tunnel that connects his and our worlds. Do you have any idea what it was? North of where I grew up is a wooded area with the remains of a house and an old mill in it. While the area has been all but razed to put up subdivisions, when I was in high school, it was a pretty rural area without any houses for quite some time. There were many rumors about these woods, nicknamed Salem's Lot by the kids in town, ranging from being a dumping ground for KKK murder victims to being an ancient forgotten graveyard, as well as the requisite stories of the unburied dead that wandered among the trees. It was Halloween in the early 90s, and while we had long left high school, we still thought about the old lot from time to time. As we were looking for a place to embrace the winter with one final bonfire of the season, someone suggested the lot. There were 4 of us that made the drive up there: Johnny, Marty, Creeping Bob, and myself. The plan was to collect enough wood to last the night while it was still light out, head back to town for food and beer, and finally head back up to the lot after dark with everyone else. We arrived at around 4:30 or 5 o'clock, pulled over to the side of the road, and made the short hike through the woods to the old mill. Upon entering the woods, Marty muttered something about being there before and took off into the trees. Being a bit of an oddball, we let him be and continued down the path. As we neared the old mill, Johnny suddenly jumped back in alarm. We looked over at what startled him and saw a young woman about 18 in a white, old-fashioned type dress that was covered in mud and dirt from head to toe. Her hair was blonde, dirty with soil, and in quite a state. I also noticed she lacked a shoe on one foot and a sock on the other. She looked at us with this wild, crazy stare and ran off back towards the road where we parked the car. Johnny, Creeping Bob, and I had all seen her and started discussing the weirdness of the situation. At this point, Marty rejoined us in the direction the girl had headed. We all asked him if he saw the girl, which he not only denied but insisted we were lying about. Because it was Halloween, he figured we made it up as a story to scare him. Marty could get violent rather quickly, so rather than try to convince him of what we saw, we just dropped it. We continued into the woods and collected a rather large pile of wood. Satisfied with our efforts, we started back to the car just as the woods were entering twilight. As we approached the spot where we first saw the creepy girl, Marty started off. "Oh, where's that girl?" he taunted. "Oh, there she is. I can see her now." No sooner had the words escaped his lips when she returned out of the darkness, walking towards us. Marty was now apologizing for not believing us and being a wise ass earlier. We parted as the girl walked between us and then started following about 10 feet behind us. By now, we were thoroughly creeped out. Marty was trying to ask if she was okay, but she simply followed in silence. As we neared the tree line on the side of the road, I turned back to her. "Do you need a ride someplace?" I asked. "No," she replied. "I am quite fine right here." She then turned and started heading back into the woods as we made a hasty retreat to the car. As we drove back to town, we all remarked on how weird it was for some girl to be wandering around in a getup like that in a remote woods without a sock and shoe. It was Ontario after all, and it gets rather cold by Halloween. If it was some kind of elaborate prank, it was a weird and crazy way to set it up. After all, we were the only ones at the lot, and had we not made plans for a bonfire there, she would have been without anyone to impress with her getup. I suggested that perhaps she was the victim of an assault, given her condition and the crazed mannerisms she displayed during our first encounter. However, had that been the case, then why would she risk a second assault by following 4 guys around the woods? One would think the victim of that type of crime would be wary of strange men immediately afterward. As we all pondered what happened in silence, Johnny finally spoke up. "I don't think she was a victim," he said. "I think she dug herself out of her own grave." I've been exploring the woods on North Side, Chicago, for more than 3 years. Bunker Hill, Edgebrook Woods, Ted Lechowicz Woods, Big Bend Lake, Des Plaines Woods, Skokie Lagoons, Schiller Woods, Axehead Lake, and Lynn Woods, and was wondering, anyone got any weirdest/crazy forest stories? These are some of my most bizarre encounters and stories. 1. Very weird tent encounter, Des Plaines, North Side, Illinois. I found a tent structure with chairs, cooking supplies, and hammock in the woods around the border lining the Des Plaines River and I-294 one night with my friend while we're going to do night fishing. We're both scared to continue into the camp at night because we didn't have weapons to defend ourselves, we didn't know if someone was living in it, and it was just scary at the time. So we left. Knowing me, I wanted to check it out fully, so I went one day, a month ago, as the sun was setting, and as I was approaching the camp, an older guy on a bike was walking from it, and he saw my fishing gear, and he said the river has a lot of fish. I approached the camp, and it had a dying fire. I assumed the guy on the bike was chilling at the camp. I kept exploring the forest. I didn't fish the river this time. Nothing strange so far until, for some reason, I returned to the camp for a third time days later and wanted to fish the river, and as I was approaching the camp, I saw the guy's bike with a trail cam pointed at it. I looked inside the tent and didn't see anyone until, out of nowhere, the older guy emerged behind the tree completely naked. I immediately covered my eyes, and he said, "I didn't know anyone was here." I kept walking towards the river as I wanted to fish, but instead I had a feeling that's not a good idea in case he looks for me. As I'm walking back to head to the trail passing the camp, the older guy looked straight at me, sitting in the chair, jerking it. I booked it out there. Never returning to that place. 2. Near vision spec ops goggles at night, Axehead Lake, North Side, Illinois. When I was fishing at Axehead Lake in the Des Plaines, this one guy cleaning the storm drain stopped me as I was walking past and was telling me about how he was at the lake very late at night and he saw a bunch of guys with night vision goggles with a girl go into the woods. I thought it was a cool story, but I believe he was a cap'n. I went solo backpacking in Uwharrie one time about 3 years ago. I backpacked into the forest about 6 or 7 miles. It was a lovely hike, and decided to set up camp a few paces off the main trail for the night. I started a fire, and before too long, it got dark, and I couldn't see more than a 7-foot radius around the fire. It was probably around 11 p.m. when I was reading my book by the fire, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw what looked to be a headlamp bobbing up and down as if someone were walking down the trail towards my campsite. I turned and looked at it. It halted, paused for a brief moment, and suddenly went dark. That alarmed me because I figured a casual night hiker would have simply kept on going past me with their headlamp illuminated, maybe even given a casual howdy as they passed by. But why would someone turn their light off as soon as they saw another person deep in the woods late at night? I spent about a minute motionless, staring into the pitch black and listening for any movement. I didn't see or hear anything. I got rather spooked and felt strongly that I was being watched. I reached for my trusty 3-inch Swiss Army pocket knife and walked over to where I last saw the light. I don't know if that was a bad idea, but I remember feeling like I couldn't just sit still and ignore what I saw. Once I got there, I poked around a little and called out a few times, but I didn't hear any responses or see any other lights. I went back to my campfire and just sat for another hour or so because I had no better idea of what to do. I eventually crawled into my tent and fell asleep with my dinky little knife clutched to my chest. I woke up the next morning in one piece, no sign of anything out of the ordinary when I looked around either. I don't know who or what it was, but that was an anxious night, to say the least. One time we had some random person walk up to our campsite around 2 a.m. in Point Reyes. They walked up and stood at the tent for about 5 minutes. We could see their headlights, then they just left. One of my friends was a light sleeper. There were bobcats screaming most of the night, so she couldn't sleep but didn't tell anyone, and she heard footsteps walking up and watched them for a couple minutes before she got the nerve to reach over and poke us awake. We all sat there for 5-ish minutes while they just stood in front with a red headlight glowing on the tent. My better judgment tells me it was probably just a ranger on patrol looking at our permit. But we all ended up staying awake most of the night after. Second, I had some random dude follow behind me about 20 meters back through Yosemite Valley in the middle of the night as I walked to the car from the backpackers camp. The weird part was that when I left my car, no one was out. It was around midnight. I started heading back, and this random dude popped out from the brush down the way. I didn't think anything of it and just kept walking. As dude got closer, I realized I went the wrong way and hit Happy Isles Bridge. So I turn and go back the right way. Dude is just standing in the distance I waved this morning and just keeping going. Dude says nothing and has no backpack or any gear with him, not even a headlight. I scurry past on the other side of the street and keep walking. I look back and see nothing, then keep going. Then I get to the intersection and look at my map. It's super confusing at night, it looks super different, and head towards backpackers camp. I hear something and look back. Dude is behind me again. I keep walking and decide to take a wide angle and walk towards the visitor center area before heading back towards the Upper Pines and backpackers camp. The dude followed me the whole way. At that point, I thought it was weird, so I decided to turn around and walk backwards for a few minutes to watch the guy. He just stayed back a little further. Finally, I just felt like that was enough and pulled out my survival knife and just walked with it in my hand. I think he got the message because he stopped and turned around. I turned my light off, cut through the woods, and stopped in the Upper Pines to see if he was following me. Nothing, so I went back to the backpackers, and everyone was like, "What did you climb Half Dome on the way?" I don't know what the creepy guy was doing, but I never saw him again. It didn't help that not one other person was out. It literally felt like it was just me and a creepy guy in the entire park. I have others, but I figure these are the most exciting. Be careful hiking. There is something in the woods. I recovered this footage from a JVC camera I found at a second-hand store. In the following text, I have tried to recount the events captured on this camcorder. Entry 1. The footage begins by panning over an autumn valley. The background is filled with the sound of a woman's voice. Beautiful, isn't it? A man responds, most likely the person holding the camera. Shut up, I'm trying to film. His tone is jovial, and after a few seconds, he adds, you're right, though, it really is. The sun is setting. Entry 2. The woman is walking in front of the camera, following a trail leading through the forest. She is wearing a bright red windbreaker, beige cargo pants, a large backpack, and black hiking boots. The man behind the camera can be heard breathing hard. Wait up. The woman stops and turns her head to face the man. She smiles and begins walking towards him. You're too slow. She chuckles. Oh, duck you. The man responds, and both of them begin to laugh. The woman reaches out her hand. Here, I'll hold that for you. The camera is handed over to the woman, and the man comes into view. He bends over, placing his hand on his knees. Oh, come on, look around you. Look at all of this beauty. I mean, don't you just get energized? What do you say we run the rest of the way? The camera swings around as the woman is talking, capturing the woods around them. The trees differ in their vibrant hues of orange, yellow, and red. There is a shape moving among them. Captured only for a brief moment. A dark brown hide and a hulking body. The man laughs. Entry 3. Darkness. To begin with, nothing of value can be made out of the video captured. Light shuffling and breathing can be heard. What is that? The woman whispers. It's probably just an animal, it must have gotten a scent of our food. It should be alright. Since we put it in a tree away from the tent, it shouldn't get too close. Something heavy can be heard circling the campsite. Aside from the sound of the animal and the man and woman breathing, it is deathly quiet. What if it's a bear? The woman's voice quivers. It'll be alright, honey, it sounds like it's moving away. The sounds of the animal lessen gradually, and after about 3 minutes, there is complete silence. Entry 4. The man is filming the campsite. Surrounding the couple's olive green tent are dozens of deep, wide tracks. The man puts his foot into one of the tracks. It is around 3 times larger than the man's boot. Big son of a bee, the man mutters. This doesn't feel safe, Adam. What if it is still around here? The woman sounds upset. Yeah, let's pack up and get out of here. Entry 5. The man is filming down a valley. A light patter of rain can be heard. Walking through the valley is a grizzly bear, accompanied by 2 cubs. The camera zooms out, and we can see the woman standing with her arms crossed. She seems concerned. She frowns, and the camera zooms back in on the bears. She must have been the one rummaging through our camp last night. Probably wanted to get her kid a quick snack. Suddenly, the 3 bears dash into the forest. Entry 6. It is dusk, and we hear the couple walking. Further up the road, in a clearing, stands a log cabin. My grandpa built this cabin back in the 40s, it ain't much, but he built it all by himself. And I mean everything, he was the one cutting down the trees. He built the fireplace. It was pretty much all he left behind when he passed. Suddenly, all the nondescript noises of the forest die. Not one bird call, not one twig snapping, nothing. The couple did not take notice. He must have been quite a man, your grandpa. The man sighs. Yup, all to wither down and die in the grand span of 3 months. I've never seen my dad like that, bloodshot eyes, stooping shoulders. It got to me. Duck, man. That was the worst part. They walk on in silence. Cancer's a shit, she says. Cancer's a shit. The couple walks for about 1.5 minutes in silence. The man filmed the ground. Suddenly, something charges the man. A grunt. He is struck either from the side or from the back. The camera falls to the ground. The woman shrieks. A high-pitched wail that pierces the veil of acidic silence. Until her scream stops, there is thrashing and moaning. Another short scream, this time coming from the man. Then there is a wet, squelching noise, and the man is silenced. We hear shuffling, whatever attacked them is turning its attention to the woman now. She is crying, light and defeated sobs are the only sounds that escape her. Then there is silence again. The attack lasts for around 4 minutes. Entry 7. A wooden floor, light breathing. Then came the mutter of a man. Shit. Entry 8. A man sits in front of the camera. His head is partially wrapped in white gauze, and his eyes are sunken. He is sitting in front of a dark brown wooden table. In front of him is a plastic bottle of water. It is half full. Behind him is a wall made of logs. Heavy rain patters against the roof of the cabin. Thunder can be heard in the distance. He sighs deeply. My name is Elliot Anderson, and I am 49 years old. I am a resident of Bend, Oregon. At this particular moment, I'm in a forest in Wyoming. There is a storm brewing outside, and I am completely ducked. Although less ducked than I would have been if I hadn't found this cabin, the man stops and takes a swig from the water bottle in front of him. Anyway, I hope the owner doesn't mind me taking shelter in here. I lost my backpack somewhere along the way. There was so much rain and thunder, complete darkness. I fell and hit my head. It was bleeding when I got here, but I'm all patched up now. Lucky for the owner, he had some medical emergencies. Too terrible he didn't stack up on some more water and canned beef. I'm hoping the storm blows over fast so I can get the duck out of here. Signing off. Entry 9. The man is sitting in front of the camera again. His head was in his hands. The water bottle has fallen over, it is empty. A kerosene lamp is burning. I figured out how to watch what's already been recorded on this thing. He pauses. Suddenly, thunder and lightning fell on the cabin. The man is illuminated. Waves of flooding rain crash against the walls, roof, and windows. Duck. They were mauled. I can't get over the sounds. I've never heard someone scream like that, let alone cry like that. They must have invaded that bear territory, it had cubs. They get crazy when someone closes in on their kids. Jesus Christ, there's a bear out there. Duck. I'm all out of water, and there isn't shit to eat in here. I'm going to wait a while. I'm praying that it lets up, otherwise, I'm going to have to brave the storm. He pauses again. If I don't make it out of here, I love you, Sarah, and I'm sorry things got all messed up. I'm a shit, I know. I don't deserve you, but if I get through this, I'll never hurt you again. The man sobs, his voice breaking. I wish I could be with you in our warm bed. Duck, I'm a ducking idiot. I love you, Sarah, I love you so much. Entry 10. I found them. It is the voice of Elliot. Not the couple, the bears. I tried to push through the storm. I was walking down the dirt road. Some of the trees have fallen, and the wind was as strong as 10 men. It felt like I was being pulled back toward the cabin by an invisible rope. I climbed over one of the fallen trees blocking the road, and that is when I found them. All 3 of them. Massacred. They had been mangled, something had snapped their bones like they were twigs. Something had slit their stomachs open. There were intestines spilling out of their bare chest cavities. I turned and ran right back to the cabin. Something has been pacing outside the walls. Something big. At first, I thought it was another bear. A freak of nature. It would have to be able to do such a thing. But it isn't a bear. Bears don't knock. I was born on the edge of the Uwaris, and I lived there until my mid-30s. I spent a lot of time there, camping, hiking, and running. The only time I ever got spooked was when I was running off the 109 trailhead and got out a little too far, too late in the day. I found myself running back at dusk without a light. I swear I kept seeing shapeshifters, bears, or animals that weren't really there. I started thinking maybe Indian spirits were messing with me. I literally prayed to God that if I got back safe, I wouldn't run out there late in the afternoon again. My friend Sean's neighbors own this big forest next to their farm. His neighbors don't mind him going into the forest once he doesn't go to their farm. Today Sean invited me and my friends Zach, Carl, and Declan. We arrived at around 5 p.m. We played basketball for a while until Zach said that we should go to the forest since it was getting dark and it would be something spooky to do since it was almost Halloween. We walked up the long pathway to the forest, which was surrounded by a short electrical fence. Once we reached the entrance to the forest, we noticed that the landowner had put up a fence at the entrance. It was electrical, but there was a way past it. Sean and Declan went ahead, while me, Carl, and Zach walked in a minute after them. As soon as we entered, we couldn't see Sean or Declan anywhere. Zach and Carl were walking and talking about the weird mushrooms on the ground until we all heard this weird laughter. It was nothing like Sean or Declan's voice, so we knew it wasn't them. A second later, I see Sean and Declan run down out of the forest into the pathway to the next forest. I told Zach and Carl, and we went on after them. It took us a bit to get out of the forest because Zach got stuck. Once we got out and started walking, I noticed Sean and Declan. A little bit behind us. There is no way they could have looped around the entire forest in 5 minutes. As soon as I saw them, I got really confused and then pretty scared. Sean and Declan explained that they just got out of the forest and saw a man in a gray jacket somewhere in or around it. We got pretty freaked out, so we decided to keep on walking ahead to the next forest. Sean was talking about an abandoned treehouse further ahead in the next forest, so that's what we wanted to see next. Once we found the entrance, a bunch of cows came over to the edge of the fence next to us and started staring at us. The cows didn't make a sound. They just stared. Zach went in first, and I followed after him. While everyone was talking, I noticed a dark figure at the end of the forest. I told Declan, but the dark figure was gone as soon as I looked back. Zach walked into the other entrance and found a white bag with blood in it and a ripped sticker. There were also needles and blood smeared all over the trees. As soon as we noticed it, the cows started mooing really loudly. Zach refused to go any further after seeing that, and the rest of us agreed that we should get back home. Carl was walking slightly ahead of us, and he apparently saw a dark figure in the distance. The whole walk back, I felt like I was being watched. Many years ago, my husband and I went to Hawaii, and afterwards, I stayed an extra day to visit the Alakai Swamp on the west end of Kauai. I got to Waimea Canyon at daybreak and was the only one there. No other cars, just some nenas, Hawaiian goose, in the parking lot. I had a bird-finding guide that made this place seem like biodiversity central. I took a camera and binoculars and was quickly seeing lots of common birds like amakihi and apapane, little green and little red guys. Plus, I was enjoying a beautiful view along the ridge trail. Anyway, a few miles on, I got to a fork in the trail and noticed a small brown bird stitching up a tree like a brown creeper. It had a very long, sickle-shaped bill. I could get a photo, so I thought nothing of it, turned the other direction, and continued down toward the swamp. Very quickly, the trail got narrower and narrower until, finally, it was just some planks over swampy water. I plowed ahead anyway. Why would the guide recommend this trail if it was impassable? And suddenly dropped, submerged shoulder deep in mud. There was no one around. I managed to pull myself out, but my camera was soaked in mud, and so was I. I found a waterfall to rinse off in, but the camera was a write-off. After I got back on the ridge trail, I still hadn't seen anyone, and I was within half a mile of the parking lot. Then, all of a sudden, I heard a sharp bird call and noticed a medium-sized black bird with a white eye ring and white patch on its wing flicking its tail downward. It was in a small shrub right along the ocean side of the trail. The moment I lifted my camera, forgetting it was useless, it dropped down, and I couldn't find it or hear it again. But I still stood there, hoping it would come back up. At that exact moment, out of the blue, other hikers suddenly appeared on the trail, streams of them, and were making fun of how muddy I was. From then on, I didn't see any other birds, just people. When I got back to the car and checked the field guide, the only birds that remotely matched the two birds I had seen but couldn't photograph were two species that had been extinct for years, Akiawoa and Kauai-owo. The owo was recently extinct, but the Akiawoa was last seen in the 1800s. I've been back to that part of Kauai since then several times and have never seen that variety or those types of birds. And it's always busy. Being a fan of Twilight Zone and other spooky stories made me wonder if I was dead too or had gone through a time portal or something. It was just the weirdest, most surreal bird walk ever. And still annoyed, I couldn't get any photos. I'd like to begin by saying I am a 57-year-old with a professional career, a son who I adore, and a husband who, like me, is completely sane but terrified at what we saw. The experience I'm going to share with you is true, and this will be the first time I am writing about it and documenting what occurred. We have only spoken about this to a few close people. Someone we knew would believe us, but for the most part, we do not speak of this, and we sure as heck do not plan to ever return to those mountains. In September 2023, me and my husband went to Asheville, North Carolina, to attend a wedding. We live on the coast of North Carolina, and the drive to Asheville is about 5 hours. We attended the wedding and still had 2 days left to explore, and on one of those days we decided on Mount Mitchell, which was only a 45-minute drive from where we were staying. We didn't realize it would be so much walking, but fortunately, we are both in decent shape. We made it to the top of Mount Mitchell, then walked about 15 minutes southeast deeper into the woods, which was the opposite of the parking lot. In between Mount Mitchell and Commissary Ridge, to be exact. The views were spectacular, however, the fog that late afternoon was so thick that you could not see too far around. It had been very rainy that week, so if you could just imagine that ambience of damp fog amid deep brush following an old dirt trail with wood planks atop a mountain, it was all so beautiful, but in a very creepy way. It was my husband who noticed it first. The smell. And it hit him like a ton of bricks. I watched him gasp for air, but then he began coughing and gagging to the point where snot was dripping from his nose. I thought he may have swallowed his water wrong, but at that moment, the smell hit me too. It wasn't just the smell, it almost burned the hair in my nostrils. It almost stung. I started dry heaving, and that exact moment we became even more taken back when a very large tree branch came crashing down a little behind and to the left of us. It startled us both, and I yelped while still gagging on the smell and burning in my nose. My husband finally got his breath, and he exclaimed, "WTF is that smell?" It is rare for my husband to use inappropriate language. The only way that I can describe the smell is vomit and stomach acid with a very strong, concentrated urine smell with a hint of spoiled milk. There was also a sweet smell of something mixed in. It was very difficult for my brain to process the smell. Sickening and putrid. I'm a nurse, and I have never been so sickened by a smell until that day. I said to my husband, "Let's head on back," and without hesitation, we did. We then immediately noticed that there was movement by the large tree branch that had fallen, now on our right side. We are walking, still coughing, and getting closer to this branch. This branch was about 20 to 25 feet long and about 40 feet away from us, off the trail. This large branch had several other smaller branches stemming off, some looking like spikes, almost. That is when we saw an animal, still moving somewhat, impaled on one of the smaller limbs or spikes of this large branch. My husband was sure it was a red fox. The fox was twitching, then appeared to have died immediately. It looked almost as if this fox had fallen from the sky. It landed right on that spiked limb, bottom first, and from its mouth protruded the end of this spike. We both knew it had to have just happened for the fox to still be twitching when we first saw it. Of course, it died within seconds. After we processed what we were looking at, a silhouette of a man appeared behind the large limb in the fog. Assuming it was an off-trail hiker, we watched the man get closer to this limb, and our eyes took a few seconds to focus, and it was a man, but not from this planet. We are still coughing and gagging and have stopped on the trail at this point. I saw what it was, and it was not a man. It was just shaped like a man. It stood 6 to 6 feet 2 inches and was both skinny and muscular at the same time. The hands were large. We could see its body was almost mangled up or deformed because of some protrusions throughout the body. It leaned to one side and stepped over this large tree branch, and we could see some kind of animal that neither my husband nor I could identify was in this thing's hand, and he took the animal, which was obviously already dead, and, with no effort at all, shoved it on the spike on top of where the fox was. I think it may have been a rabbit just because of the size. Our coughing and gagging continued, and I got very dizzy. It looked at my husband first, then turned its head slowly and looked at me. That face. It's a face I will never forget and a face that I wish I could forget. Its eyes were cloudy and gray. It looked like there were no eyelids. The right eye socket was higher on its face than the left eye. I don't remember anything else about its face except that it was chewing very slowly, and it tilted its head some while still looking our way. The body looked like a man. The ribcage protruded some. His skin looked ripped in some areas, and then some areas almost looked burnt to a crisp, but the overall skin color was a pale gray or pink. Very odd color. Me and my husband are now walking backward as we watch us back away. What it did, then, I'll never forget. It raised its hand, took its pointer finger, and moved it back and forth, like tisk tisk tisk, or no no no, as if we were not supposed to be there. It moved its finger like that a few times while still chewing, and its head tilted, and I began crying immediately and crying hard to the point where my body convulsed. My husband gripped my hand harder, and we continued to back away, still walking almost backward carefully, until we walked around a curve in the path and lost sight. It stared at us right up until that moment. We ran as fast as a couple in their 50s could while still hysterically crying. We make it to the Mount Mitchell parking lot, and we get into our truck, doors locked, and drive away. We can still smell it. It's burned into our nostrils, and we're still coughing some. My husband then, all of a sudden, pulls over to the side of the road, opens his door, and vomits on the ground. He then says, "That was not a Bigfoot." And I replied, "I know." We didn't know what it was, but all we knew was that it was not a Bigfoot. We left a day early and took the 5-hour drive back, and that was all we could think about. My very religious husband believed it was a demonic entity. I still was not sure what I saw until someone that I shared my story with shared this link with me, and that's when I finally had a name for what we had seen. I spent hours on the topic and then shared it with my husband. We know we encountered a feral human. After a long debate, we finally decided that we would not report the encounter to park services out of fear of being laughed at. I want to also add that I am the biggest skeptic there is, but what my eyes saw that day was almost incomprehensible, something that the eyes of mankind should never gaze upon. Even 6 months later, I can still see it, and I can still sometimes get a whiff of it. It's embedded in my being. That encounter has made me question everything I thought I knew about life. And just know that we do not plan to return to those mountains ever again, and I pray that those who do visit will please be careful. And over these past few months, having time to think about it all, I recall that it almost felt like something was watching us from the opposite side of the trail, and me and my husband have wondered if there were more than one out there. There are feral humans in those mountains, and I do not question that. I live on a 20-acre horse ranch in the panhandle of Florida, about a half hour from the Alabama border, and 15 minutes ago I heard the strangest animal sounds I've ever heard. It happened almost right outside the property, which is only about 50 feet away from where I am right now. It was a very, very loud whistle. I heard it 4 times, spaced out by like 15 to 30 seconds. Each whistle was different, had no repeating tunes or notes, and was loud enough to sound like it was echoing across the property. After the 4 whistles, it was followed up with an almost sigh sound, then nothing. So to sum it up, it sounded like somebody was facing the property just outside the fence line, whistling 4 different tunes, followed by an almost frustrated sigh, then silence. What's even more strange is that it was dead quiet while this was happening. Shortly after the silence, I could hear a pack of coyotes in the distance, which happens all the time, and owls over the lake, which is also frequent. Also, to be clear, where the sound was coming from is an open field. It's just so dark outside that I can't see in front of my face. The weirdest thing is that we're more likely to hear gunshots than other people out here. The closest neighbors are like a half mile away in the other direction. This sound came from the roadside of the property. The closest neighbors in that direction are even further than a half mile. And we have 2 donkeys on the property to ward off predators, and I didn't hear either of them warning the herd, which would mean that maybe it was a human I was hearing. But like I said, the property is fenced and gated, so they would need to hop the fence. And whistling is a weird thing to do when you're trespassing in an area where shooting is common. Anyone have any ideas? So back in 2015, I had the choice of getting a dog or a smartphone. I'd never had a dog in my life, or a decent phone, come to think of it, and I'd been saving up for a phone anyhow, so naturally I picked the dog. My dad knew a feller who had a couple of border collies that had recently had a litter. So, we drove out, and the dude gave me the last puppy. Enter Bailey. A couple weeks after he got his shots, I started walking him. My parents figured I was going to be hanging out at the local park with my new pup so I could get him socialized, but no. I chose to take him around the perimeter of a nearby farm to keep the farm dog with him. I'd been sneaking out to this farm for years. The farmer was an old family friend. My uncles had grown up working for him, so I knew if I was ever caught, I could just drop their name. On either side of the farm, there was some dense woodland, which no one had ever given me reason to be wary of. They probably should have. So, it's a sunny afternoon, it had been pouring down all week, and Bailey was itching for a good walk. I take him to the farm at our usual time, and we start making our way around to the woods on the east side of the farm. Everything is quiet, but Bailey keeps starting away from me to explore. He's a puppy, it's what they do, but of course I've been calling his name all the way around the field. We're about halfway through the woods, and I could see the roof of the farmhouse over the next hill. Bailey's been pulling crap out of the bushes all the way along, and I'd just given him trouble for rolling in a pile of fox crap. That's when I hear a man's voice calling my dog by his name. Like this dude I didn't even know was calling my dog by name. I knew it wasn't the farmer because I'd met him at family events like BBQs, weddings, etc., so I knew what his voice sounded like. I go completely silent, but the guy keeps calling on my dog. It sounds like he's deep into the woods and maybe moving. He's calling my dog with an excited tone in his voice, which is what creeps me out the most. Bailey, meanwhile, is completely ignoring this guy and sniffing the now flat pile of poop. I'm like a tiny, 18-year-old girl. The most combat experience I have is a month learning Taekwondo when I was 11. And I don't have a mobile phone. If that guy works out where I am, I'm ducked, and if Bailey decides to go in after him, I'm double ducked because I am not letting a possible psycho get his hands on my puppy. I can either run to the farm, which isn't too far away, or run back through the field towards home. I pick up my dog and sprint across the field. Behind me, I hear someone emerge from the woods, but I'm already over the fence and sprinting back home with my puppy tucked under my arm. I get home and tell my mom. She brushes it off like some weird drunk guy. A few weeks later, I'm at my uncle's house, and the farmer walks in. I'd told my uncle what happened, so he brought it up. The farmer asks exactly which woods I'd been close to and says that some of his clothes have gone missing from his washing line. He'd put it down to strong winds, but now he's not sure. I take him and my uncle to the exact spot the next day, and all three of us go in and find a completely wrecked campsite. There's no clothes or anything, but the tent has collapsed in on itself. There's no fire, but there are some empty gas canisters, like you'd use for a portable stove, and empty packets of food scattered everywhere. We report it to the police, but nothing ever really comes of it. Except that I got a phone not long after and keep it on me whenever I go out. So one night, me and my friends were playing some hide and seek in our hometown. We were probably like 13 at the time. So I went into a small area that is basically like a shortcut from the main road to the side road. Unfortunately, I went alone, and I didn't even think of what could happen. Remember, we were only 13 at the time, and we didn't bring phones with us, so if something happened to us, nobody would even know. So the game started, and I ran, sprinting to the woods area. The first 30 seconds were good. Disclaimer, we have a rule that we have to come to the checkpoint where we start, and we have to save ourselves from not getting picked to search. After around 1 minute, I started hearing footsteps. I ask, "Hello, are you one of my friends?" And something that was there didn't say anything, so I started backing out. Fortunately, the woods area has a main route and two side ones, so I could have run either way. I start backing out, and from nowhere, the man just appears from the woods and starts sprinting at me while saying, "I'm going to catch you," in a creepy and eerie way. Like a kidnapper. Fortunately, I train in football, soccer, so I knew I could definitely outrun him or at least make him tired. I sprinted all my way through the woods with the only light being the moonlight, and after around 2 minutes, he gave up. I continued sprinting, got myself all the way to the checkpoint, and told all of my friends what had just happened. Of course, no one believed, but I didn't care since I knew it was real. To this day, I still don't know who or what tried to catch me that night, but for sure, if I wasn't a sports guy, the outcome would be very, very different. 7 years ago, my wife and I purchased a property and 11 acres of woods in a rural part of northeastern Minnesota. I'm not a believer in the supernatural and have never been afraid of the woods or the outdoors, even though I have a healthy sense of caution and respect for large bears, moose, wolves, or other potentially dangerous wildlife. I am also an avid hunter and mountaineer and have experienced many nights in the wilderness. I've had numerous encounters with dangerous animals or situations, so I'm not spooked easily. Knowing my state of mind is important to my story because many so-called supernatural encounters can be explained by people with an already high level of belief, anxiety, or fear. That's not me. Well, that all changed after the first few weeks of moving in. The house and land had been abandoned for a couple of years due to foreclosure, so a lot of work needed to be done to get them back into shape. Wildlife had grown accustomed to no human presence, and black bears frequently roamed the yard at night, along with many other woodland creatures. We also found a lot of animal bones scattered throughout the woods, and coyotes were abundant. One night during those first few weeks, we had a rainstorm, and I was worried about a broken downspout potentially causing a basement leak. It was about 10 p.m., so I grabbed my headlamp and headed outside to deal with the situation. Behind our house is a fairly large swampy area that divides the woods. I had my back facing this area while fiddling with the downspout when suddenly I had this intense feeling of dread. It's difficult to explain the feeling, but it was like my body knew something was back there. It wasn't a normal feeling or observation. Never having felt this type of fear before, I tried to stay calm and slowly turned around to point my headlamp back towards the swamp. What I saw was something I still can't explain. Eyes, numerous glowing or reflecting eyes, stare back at me. These were not eye reflections that you typically see with a deer or other animals since they were at different heights, and when I pointed my headlamp spot beam directly at where you would expect a head to be, there was nothing there but weeds and trees. When I turned the headlamp off, they were still there and glowing as if a light were being shined. They did not move, they just stared through me. Needless to say, I bolted and ran as fast as I could back into the house and explained it away as deer or raccoons. Later that summer, I was sitting out on our screened-in porch that partially faces the swamp and connected woods to the west. It was approximately 11 p.m. when I began to hear what sounded like a bear fighting with or attacking a cow. Since there was a small farm to the southwest of my property, I assumed that perhaps a cow had wandered into the woods and been attacked by a bear. I really didn't know if this was something a bear would actually do, but it was my only guess based on the sounds I was hearing at the time. It was clearly some kind of roar, like a bear, but then followed by a frantic-sounding cow mooing. This went on for over an hour, and it was perhaps one of the most horrible sounds I've ever heard. It did not frighten me since I had this rational explanation in my head. Even weirder, this same series of sounds happened again the next summer. I never investigated the area of the woods where these sounds came from since it was not my property. A couple of years later, I had the chance to purchase this area and 70 acres to the west, which consisted of the woods that connected to mine as well as a few tilled fields, more woods, and ponds. As part of purchasing this land, I of course spent a great deal of time walking around it to get a good understanding of its value and layout. As part of my walk, I was able to get a much better look at the farm setup to the south. The farm did have cows, as I suspected, but to my surprise, the area they were kept in was a long distance from my house. It was much too far for me to hear them, and the fencing was also extremely well built and electrified. Looking at it, there was just no way a cow was wandering off from that farm. I didn't really think about this fact until recently, but I feel it's best to lay everything out in chronological order. After obtaining the property, I proceeded to put up tree stands at various locations along with trail cameras in order to prepare for the upcoming deer hunting season. One spot was the hilly woods, where I heard those sounds many years prior. Again, I did not connect these two things until now. The area was very odd, as whenever I hiked through there, I always saw some new strange thing. One time, my son and I found an old game snare tied to a tree with what looked to be dried blood on the tree bark. Another time, we found at least a 100-year-old tree with a barbed wire fence completely spiraling the entire trunk, growing in and out of it at different intervals. I've also found many tree trunks with very large scratches or claw marks not resembling an antler rub. Perhaps a bear? We'd almost always find dead animal bones in this area, and even this winter, I discovered a couple of deer legs snapped and picked clean. My sons have found numerous animal skulls there as well. As I was saying, I put a game camera in this area since I'd seen tracks and signs and wanted to get a sense of the best places to hunt. I've tried one there many times, and unlike my other cameras, I've never captured anything at all on the camera. Nothing. My son has posted there a couple of times for hunting season and mentioned the strange sense of quiet. He's used to the forest sounds coming back after sitting still for long periods of time, but in this spot there are never any sounds. He has mentioned hearing something walking around, though. A couple of years ago, my son went out hiking in the woods to try and find me since I was out doing some forest management. As he walked through this area, he thought he spotted me coming through the woods fast, but quickly noticed the walk and clothing were nothing like mine. He said the person he saw did not notice him at all and seemed to be walking in a straight line, like they had tunnel vision or something. Seeing someone in this part of the woods and their direction of travel don't at all make sense since there really would be no reason to be there or to be headed that way as it leads to deep ravines and an uncrossable river. After he found me and explained what he saw, I quickly went over to investigate to see if we had a trespasser. I hiked for quite a while but never found anything or anyone. If someone was there, they either got picked up on the road or vanished. That same year, my son had a friend over, and they went for a late afternoon walk in the woods. As it began to get dark, they made their way back by walking on the edge of the field that is next to this area of woods. As they passed by, they said they saw a figure a little ways off in the trees. Whatever they saw was near one of the hills in this patch of forest and seemed to be making some kind of hand gesture. It began walking slowly towards them when they called out, "Hey, hello." He or it stopped still and said nothing. At this point, the boys sensed something wasn't right and bolted back toward the house. They rushed into the house and told me what they saw, and I of course laughed it off as their minds played tricks on them. My son described the figure as very tall, like 10 to 15 feet, but with skinny arms, and his body was dark all over. Not hairy per se, but dark. They even thought it was an animal at first because of the weird way it looked. He couldn't really describe it very well, other than gaunt, skinny, and strangely dark. Being the curious and protective father I am, I was worried about it being trespassers, drug addicts, or both, so I told them I would go take a look. They brought me to the area and pointed to where it was standing, and I headed into the woods. Since it was winter and there was snow on the ground, I thought it would be simple to locate the tracks of whatever this was and find out where it came from or went to. When I got to the spot, there wasn't a single track or disturbance in the snow. There was no way an animal or man could have been in that area and not left tracks. They had either made it up, or their minds had played tricks on them. Or so I thought. To this day, my son and his friends still swear they saw it as clear as day, and I can definitely attest that their fright was real. My wife has also experienced strange thrashing sounds and other feelings of dread or being watched in this part of the woods and generally refuses to go over there anymore. All of this brings me to today, where I had a sudden realization that all of the strange sounds, sightings, bones, and events seem to be centered around this one area, and I'm just at a complete loss for what it all means. It's all too strange to really bring this up and discuss it with people I know around here, but I wanted to share my story and see if anyone in this community might have any theories or ideas on what we might be dealing with here. I'll continue to investigate on my end, but I would love to see what you all think. I hiked into Panther Gorge a couple years ago. I set up my tarp after climbing Skylight. I was always told to take a rock to put on the summit of Skylight, or else it would rain that night. Since the forecast did not call for rain and I don't believe in stuff like that, I ignored the tale. About 10 p.m., I woke up to a downpour. After 2 hours, water started leaking underneath my tarp, so I grabbed my sleeping bag and headlamp and sprinted into the lean, about 1/4 mile from my tarp. I got there, and it was empty, so I snuggled into the bag and fell asleep. At some point, I wake up. It's still raining, and I hear what sounds like someone dressed in plastic bags walking quickly towards the lean, but they didn't have a headlamp or any light source. I feel a thump on the floor. I'm just lying in my bag, not moving, wanting to get a bit more sleep. Whoever it was lit their stove and heated up what I assumed was tea or coffee. I figure after they were done, they would settle down and go to sleep, but after they had their drink, they packed up their gear and headed out into the pouring rain again. At this point, I checked my watch, it was 3 a.m. I fell back asleep and woke up around 6, but there was no sign anyone had been there. No damp spots inside the lean-to, no boot prints around the shelter. I know I didn't dream it, but for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why the person did what they did. I live in the PA wilds. There's more than just nature in these woods. The Appalachian mountain range is ancient, and what many people would consider folklore has more meaning here than in many other places. I always tell people that north central PA is a magical place, but I'm not sure they understand that. I mean, more literally than not. We have a lake built over an Indian burial ground, Johnny Cash made a song about it, a triple continental divide, tales of Civil War gold just gone missing, tales of mobsters living in our area during Prohibition, old-growth forests, miles and miles of empty land, even our own inbred family. This story isn't about them and won't be. I've heard from everyone who's met the few that remain that they are nice people just a bit off. I guess I'll start this off by talking about what I call wild spirits. The first time I encountered one was in my youth. It's hard to say when exactly, as many childhood years seem to run together, but if I had to guess, I would say I was 6 or 7. The memory of this day will stick with me forever, though. It was either the summer before or after my parents divorced, and I was living with my sister, mother, grandma, and grandpa in their house on what used to be my grandmother's father's farm. As we often did as children, my sister and I went off to play in the creek near the original farmhouse where my grandma had grown up. We had made and broken many little dams on that stream over the years, along with catching crayfish, salamanders, and the occasional frog. This day, however, we decided to head further upstream than normal, up past our great-grandfather's old rock crusher. I was flipping rocks looking for crayfish when a shadow was cast over me. I didn't look for a bit, assuming it was my sister. When I did look up, my breath caught in my throat. Across the creek from me, not 4 feet away, was a dog. Now I say a dog because it was either the biggest damn coyote I've ever seen in my 30 years of life or a wolf, but they're not supposed to live here anymore. I'm sure some of you are thinking that it probably just looked that way because I was small or because I was scared, but I assure you that's not it. I've spent most of my life in these woods, from the time I could walk until today, being an avid outdoorsman. I've been closer than 4 feet to coyotes many times, both alive and dead. I even scruffed an exhausted one and helped it swim across a lake when I had a boat. This dog, though it was different, not just bigger, was staring at me as I was frozen there. Its golden eyes boring into my own as if searching my soul, for what I don't know, but at the time I figured it was looking for its chance to strike. I don't know how long we stared at each other, but all of a sudden I heard my sister yell my name, and my head jerked to look for her, either for help or to warn her. She was just coming around a bush at a bend just downstream from me, and when I looked back to where the dog had been, it was simply gone, no noise, no indication it had ever been there. I asked my sister if she had seen it, and she just looked at me confused. I told my grandparents about it, but all they told me was that I shouldn't be playing that far into the woods. The next time I encountered one was a few years later, fishing with my father. We were fishing down one of the streams that feed into the lake I mentioned earlier, just coming to where it opens up into the lake. Growing up in the 90s and seeing quicksand in tons of shows, I should have been watching where I was walking better. However, I waded out into the start of the lake, where I couldn't see any rocks or vegetation on the lake floor, and before I realized it, I was sinking. The mud and muck were up to my knees, and the water was coming into my hip boots when I saw it. It being a muskie, as best I can describe it. It darted at me, shocking me into falling over and under the water. Anyone who fishes this lake knows they're there and knows generally what they look like. This one was gold, and as it swam past me, I could swear it had human eyes and an intelligence greater than a fish should possess. As the fish swam away, I realized that I was buoyant enough to slide my legs out of my hip boots, allowing them to flatten out, and that I was able to pull them up out of the mire. I got back to shore winded and soaked, but I simply told my dad that I had slipped off a log and fell in, not sure how to explain what had happened. The third one, which I have encountered and sometimes still do, is a bit different from the first two. I've never felt threatened by it or even uneasy, but it definitely doesn't want to interact. In the area where my family and I hunt, there's a spot we call the Big Swamp. There are a few odd things about the swamp. For starters, it's on top of a hill. I'm not sure if it's the clay underneath that just doesn't let the water drain properly or what, but it's the only place I've personally seen it. The second is that once you're about 15 feet off the path, even in winter when there are no leaves, you can't see it anymore. In fact, unless you find one of the few large trees in the area or stumble into one of the clearings where the ground is too wet to support much more than sphagnum moss, which usually includes your feet, it's hard to see past 15 feet in any direction. This leads to the third oddity: GPS doesn't seem to work properly inside the swamp. It took me over 16 years of hunting there to finally be able to come out onto the road where I wanted, and I still get turned around inside many times when I go in. I don't have a helpful GPS, just Google Maps on my phone. I've tried to use it to help me get through, but for some reason, it doesn't help at all. It has shown me right by the road, but it's taken me 15 minutes to get out, and it's demonstrated me a quarter mile back, but I'm at the road in just a few steps. The fourth oddity, which may not be that strange considering the previous 3 points, is that no one outside of my family ever hunts that area. I do mention this for a reason, though. We run into families that have hunted out there for as many generations as mine, and they hunt all around the swamp but never in it, even with them seeing us get at least one deer out of there each year. I've never even come across a boot print that I didn't know was from my dad, uncles, cousins, or myself in there. However, I have seen other footprints. Now to get down to the spirit that lives in the swamp, she, and yes, I'm fairly sure it's a she, and I have never interacted per se. I've seen her, and I'm fairly sure she watches us in there, but we've never met face to face. I've seen long, dark hair moving away from me at the edge of the swamp, where I can see faster than a person should be able to move in the swamp. I've seen various animal legs through the underbrush, and when I've reached that spot, there's been a human-shaped footprint, and I'm sure I've seen bare human feet through the underbrush through my periphery, shadowing my movements through the scrubs. I've never gone looking for her and don't intend to try. She seems content to stay away from us, and I think the reason it is so hard to find your way through is that she doesn't want to be found. I'm not going to tempt fate and the supernatural and possibly anger her. There are so many things that go on in these woods that we have no idea about. These are just a few that I personally have seen. It's time for me to go to bed, however, so I'll leave off there for now. Maybe I'll tell you all more another time. I didn't know how else to title this except with what exactly is occurring. I obviously don't know what exactly is occurring, or else I wouldn't be sharing this here. I'm not insane. At least, I don't think I am. I'll start at the beginning. I've lived in upstate New York my whole life. I recently inherited a house in the mountains. I'd rather not disclose where exactly, but there's not much around me. It's not much at all, but it's nice. At least it was, until I started to get this feeling that something wasn't right. There's a bay window in my living room that looks into the backyard. I close the curtains every night and open them every morning, only it's not the same view each day. It took me longer than it should have to realize this. Out the window, there's an open field surrounded by woods. The house sits on a little less than an acre. I do my best to keep up with it. 3 trees stand tall in the field, but never in the same places. They're each in completely different spots every morning, with the ground seemingly unfazed. I swear to God. I know there are walking sticks, but I've never heard of walking trees. So, my first thought was to start taking pictures every morning. I don't know why, to track their movements, I guess, and to have physical proof, even though I knew for a fact. So, I took one and went to compare them the next day. I opened the curtain, and the trees were in the same spots as the day before, I think, the first time since I moved in. I know. Convenient, right? Well, they haven't moved since, so I have no proof. It's like they knew. All I have is a photo of the field, which won't do much good. Still, I obsessively check every morning. I'm not afraid. I'm just weirded out, uneasy. I don't know what any of this means. I'm not sleeping as well, but besides that, it's not really infringing upon my life in any way. It's just strange. It's the strangest damn thing I've ever experienced. I live alone, and I haven't told anyone in my life out of fear of what they might think or say. So this is the first time this has left my head. I just wanted to share my story. Last night, I had some more weird shit happen. I took my 2 dogs for walks. I normally walk Finn, a large, all-black German Shepherd, toward the park where I have had these experiences, and I walk Booger, a Chit Terrier mix, the other direction toward downtown. On my walk with Finn, about a block away in the direction I was headed, I saw 3 or 4 deer calmly walking toward the park. Most nights where something weird happens to me start like this. The deer seemed completely unbothered by me as I approached. They kept walking toward the park but stopped every few steps to look back at me, as if they wanted me to follow them. Then, as Finn and I reached where the deer were, I noticed about 10 or more other deer waiting as well. They all start walking together, calm, but still looking back at me every few feet. On my way toward the park, I smell the stench of rotting meat. I know the smell very well, as I used to be a butcher. It was strong. Like someone plugged my nostrils with rotting ground meat or something. At the same time I smell this stench, I get chills. Finn's hair stands up, and he gets more nervous. I can feel the air around me get colder. As we continue walking, I look down an alleyway that cuts the block in half, and if you would walk down the dark alley, I would spot you out, where I eventually walk back home. I was 2 blocks away from the park. When you reach the park, you can either turn around and walk down the same road, continue into the park, or continue on the road that turns left. Looking down that alleyway, you see the part of the road that continues left, which is the way I take every night on my way back home. What I saw I tried to convince myself wasn't real, or maybe I just saw something else and my brain tried to convince me it was this. A large, muscular, pale, hairless creature was moving fast. So fast I could barely see it. I saw the motion down the alley, about 2 blocks away. The exit of the alley on that side has a street light directly above it. It wasn't standing still, it was moving, and it was moving fast. The only reason I'm positive what I saw wasn't deer or something normal is because of something I saw later that night that I will write about when I talk about my walk with Booger. It solidified that what I saw was something I wasn't supposed to see. In the meantime, I convinced myself I was making stuff up and being a pussycat. As we approached the tree line of the park, a large group of deer moved to the side of the street where the neighborhood is, while I'm on the side with the tree line. I noticed something in the clearing. A lone deer, separate from the large group across the street, stared directly at me. I have my flashlight pointed at him, and I even hung up my call with my wife to use my phone to take video of this moment. This lone deer doesn't even have micro-movements from breathing. The other deer across the street were constantly readjusting. You might be thinking to yourself, oh yeah, deer do that with bright lights shining at them. Deer in headlights always act like that. Just wait. Finn starts to pull strongly and acts anxious, nearly knocking me over. I turn to look across the street towards the large group of deer for at most 3 seconds before quickly turning around to face the lone deer again. In those 3 seconds, that lone deer is easily 30 feet closer to me, still not moving, staring directly at me. I have this on video, I have pictures. I felt weird, I felt unsafe. I've lived in rural Iowa my whole life, and I have always lived outdoors. This didn't feel normal. I was scared. I backed away while shining my light at the deer. Once I get a block or so away, he finally turns around and calmly walks into the tree line. The whole way home, I feel like I'm being stalked, not just watched, but like something is following me. Now, I went home and sat for a bit and tried to talk myself into believing it was all a coincidence. After nearly 20 minutes, I started to walk Booger, my smaller chi mix. The entire walk was nice and very enjoyable, actually. I had my earbuds in and was talking to my wife about what I saw in a joking way. "Man, I'm such a pussycat, I really scared myself for no reason," I said. At the end of the walk, I turned to go down our alleyway as I leave from the garage on our walks. I stopped speaking from what I saw on the opposite end of the alley. My wife heard me stop. I want to preface this with I did not have any substances, including alcohol, for weeks up to that point. The most I ever do in that department is have a few beers, or I'll use some weed to ease anxiety if life is getting hard. I have no mental conditions that will cause me to hallucinate. The most I have is a personality disorder resulting from trauma that I've been overcoming quickly this past year. I saw 2 large, muscular, pale, hairless creatures walking like apes at the end of the alley. The same thing I thought I saw with Finn, this time not going fast, much closer, and it felt intentional. I saw them walk across the street very slowly, staring directly at me. These were not deer. They didn't have long faces like deer, they didn't have fur or tails, and they didn't walk like deer. They weren't slender like deer. My first thought was, honestly, that I was looking at 2 hairless male lions. In the middle of Iowa. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, well after they had left my sight. 15 seconds later, I finally get the courage to walk a few feet into the garage. When I take my first step, I see a third one. Slowly meandering across the street. Staring at me. Booger noticed him too, and he started growling. I ran to the door and watched the garage shut completely. The entire night, Finn guarded the bedroom door. He never does that. He sat staring at the door all night. Booger stared at the windows all night. He never does that either. I don't know what to think.